As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
All right, now let's turn to Aristotle's epistemology systematically. And the first question that we ask is, what do we begin with as far as knowledge is concerned? What legacy do we have at birth, cognitively? And Aristotle's answer to that question is very simple: nothing. We have no innate ideas. To know reality, you have to come in contact with it. There is no life prior to this one. At birth, therefore, we are, he says in a famous simile, like a blank tablet, a tabula rasa, T-A-B-U-L-A-R-A-S-A, which is a term that simply means a blank slate. It has no connection to horticulture and no relation to tubular roses. All knowledge, says Aristotle, must start with sense experience. Now, this viewpoint is often called empiricism and contrasted with rationalism. Empiricism, in this sense, is the view that all knowledge is based on and derived from the evidence of the senses. In other words, that there is no innate cognitive content. Now, this definition, as I've just given it, if you understand it in that sense of the term, it's fair to say that Aristotle is an empiricist in contrast to a rationalist. However, since the 18th century, since the time of David Hume, empiricism, for reasons we will see, became synonymous with subjectivism and skepticism of every variety. It became the view that we can acquire knowledge only by the senses, and there is no such faculty as reason at all. Now, in that sense of the term, Aristotle is not an empiricist any more than he's a rationalist. He is simply rational, that is to say, an Aristotelian. But if you use empiricism in its pre-Humean sense, you can call Aristotle an empiricist. And his philosophy is the first influential statement in history of this allegedly obvious fact that knowledge begins with the evidence of the senses. Knowledge for Aristotle is looking out to discover the facts of the world, not introspecting, not reasoning from constructs. And if you ever reach an allegedly rational conclusion which contradicts the evidence of the senses, you simply know you've made a mistake somewhere. All theories have to take their point of departure from the facts. You cannot write off the evidence of the senses as a deception, because that's where knowledge begins. The senses, in a word, are valid. They give us an awareness of reality as it is. Now, as one point in his defense of the senses, Aristotle was the first influential philosopher to say, in regard to illusions, that we must make a clear distinction between what the senses contribute and the interpretation supplied by the mind. And so, you know, if you look at a bent stick in water, a stick that's actually straight but appears bent, all the skeptics across the centuries moan. These are the lesser skeptics. Oh, you see, our senses deceive us because it looks bent and it's really straight. Aristotle says the senses do not deceive you. They give you the actual evidence of the facts. The senses cannot deceive you. The error comes in the conclusion that you make and the theory you put forth to interpret the data. In your saying that the cause of it is that the stick actually bends in the water rather than some other explanation. But don't blame the senses for your confused or erroneous intellectual interpretations. That is an Aristotelian point in defense of the senses. Now, as to the deeper questions about the senses, the argument of the sophists that the senses are across the board invalid because they distort by their very nature, I have to postpone Aristotle's answer until that, because you need to know more of his fundamental philosophy to understand his answer.
So the big story over the weekend, this happened on Friday, was that Israeli troops in Gaza shot and killed 3 Israeli hostages that had escaped captivity. And now the Netanyahu government is coming under increasing domestic pressure to reach a new hostage deal with Hamas after the Israeli military mistakenly killed 3 Israelis. So the situation, the way that this went down in Gaza was that these 3 Israeli hostages, again, they had escaped from captivity, and they were shirtless and waving a white flag, and the Israeli forces opened fire on them anyway. 2 of them died immediately. A third was wounded and sought shelter in a nearby building. He then cried out for help in Hebrew, but was shot again and killed. So many hostage families are outraged by this incident. And one of the victims' brothers said at a funeral for him that the Israeli military murdered his brother. The quote was, "Those who abandoned you also murdered you after all that you did right," end quote. So family members of Israeli hostages in Gaza met with ministers in Netanyahu's war cabinet on Saturday and called for Israel to cease its current operations and work toward another deal with Hamas. And despite these growing calls for diplomacy, Netanyahu said, quote, "After we have eradicated Hamas and Gaza will be demilitarized under the control of Israel, there will be no one who will educate their children to annihilate Israel," end quote. So again, expressing long-term plans for a military occupation. Major shipping companies are stopping transits through the Red Sea due to attacks from Yemen's Houthis that have come in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. So The Economist reported that Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, and the Mediterranean Shipping Company have all paused or suspended services in the Red Sea. And this is 4 out of 5 out of the 5 largest container shipping companies in the world. So it's a big deal. And the Hong Kong-based container shipping line OOCL has announced that it was suspending all shipments to and from Israel. This is, really risks a major impact on the global economy. By avoiding the Suez Canal, Mediterranean or European-bound ships have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, and that adds thousands and thousands of nautical miles to their voyage. That's lots of fuel that they have to burn, really can increase the price of things. And the Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, sometimes when I say that, people think I said formerly, but they are formally, it's their formal name, is Ansar Allah, and they have declared all commercial vessels that are heading to or from Israel will be targeted. Houthi officials have said the only way to restore calm to the region is for a lasting ceasefire to be reached in Gaza. And attacks continued over the weekend. U.S. Central Command said that U.S. and British warships downed 15 drones early on Saturday morning that were fired from Houthi-controlled Yemen. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is headed to the region this week and is expected to announce the formation of a new international naval operation to respond to the Houthi attacks known as Operation Prosperity Guardian. Mohammed al-Bukaiti, who's a member of the Houthis' political bureau, he responded to the news and said that the U.S. would be forming the filthiest coalition in history. He said, quote, "How will the countries that rushed to form an international coalition against Yemen to protect the perpetrators of Israeli genocide be perceived?" End quote. So the U.S. is warning it could take military action against the Houthis. Apparently, they've conveyed some threats to them. And they're also threatening to kill this peace deal that the Houthis and the Saudis reached. So this can get really bad, I think, in the region, especially, if they send this big naval task force and they really start firing back and forth. And if the U.S. bombs Yemen directly, things could really explode. And so this article is from the New York Times, and it is about these Ukrainian Marines that are being sent, and I wasn't aware of this, across the Dnipro River. I usually call it the Dnieper River in Ukraine, but it seems that it's more commonly referred to as the Dnipro River now. But this report is about these Ukrainian Marines that are being sent across the river, basically on a suicide mission. They're in an attempt to recapture territory from Russian troops, but apparently when they get over there, they get killed. And many waves of Marines have been sent across the river, and they're speaking out. For 2 months this has been going on, and now these Ukrainian troops are spoke to the New York Times about it. It says conditions are so difficult. A half dozen men involved in the fighting said in interviews that in most places there is nowhere to dig in. The first approaches tend to be marshy islands threaded with rivulets or meadows that have been a quagmire of mud and bomb craters filled with water. The soldiers and Marines gave only their first names or asked for anonymity for security reasons, and commanders declined almost all media requests to visit military units in the Kherson region. So this is something, it says that several soldiers and Marines spoke to journalists out of concern about the high casualties and what they said were overly optimistic accounts from officials about the progress of the offensive. So this is what Biden is looking to fund for more than a year, these kind of hopeless missions that is just going to get so many, Ukrainians killed. For what reason other than enriching, Lloyd Austin's friends at Raytheon and just kind of trying to keep Russia bogged down in this war. Russian President Vladimir Putin has dismissed President Biden's claim that Russia will attack NATO territory if it wins the war in Ukraine, calling the idea nonsense. So we've seen this from Biden, from Biden administration officials, this claim that if they don't fund the war in Ukraine, Russia's going to, conquer the country and then roll into Eastern Europe. And that means direct war with NATO, and U.S. troops are going to have to fight. Your sons and daughters are going to be sent. I mean, this is what they've been saying. One quote here from Biden, he said, quote, "If Putin attacks a NATO ally, if he keeps going and then he attacks a NATO ally, well, we've committed as a NATO member that we defend every inch of NATO territory. Then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today. American troops fighting Russian troops. American troops fighting Russian troops if he moves into other parts of NATO," end quote. So responding to this claim, Putin said that he had no interest in fighting NATO. He said, quote, "It is complete nonsense, and I think President Biden understands that. Russia has no reason, no interest, no geopolitical interest neither economic, political, nor military to fight with NATO countries, end quote. And I think that is clear now because if Russia wanted to go to war with NATO, they have the pretext. NATO's been funding this war, and not just funding it, not just providing weapons, but providing intelligence, building up Ukraine's intelligence services so they could carry out sabotage attacks inside Russia, Crimea. If the shoe was on the other foot, the U.S. would have declared war against Russia a long time ago.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
I can't quite put my finger on it, but the question of, have you seen any evidence of it? It's, if a cop comes to my car and says, hey, I want to search your car, and I say no, that's not proof of the fact that there's something that I'm hiding in my car.
Sure.
I'm exerting my right, and I have no reason to make it easier for a cop to try and find a reason for me to be in trouble. When it comes to this one, it's kind of the wrong question because, yes, I guess there's no direct evidence, but there's some very strong questions as to why they can't release all the footage, or why can't they answer a question as to whether or not there were agent provocateurs that day? Why was there scaffolding there? Why was there no military support brought in? Why was the head of security? Wasn't there some article? Oh, yeah, that was the interview that Tucker couldn't air while he was on Fox, and then he did a new interview with like the old head of security who was talking about all
the head of the Capitol Police, yeah, the
failures that day, and that he had escalated the need for, I think, more support. I don't remember it that clearly, but it's in a way it's a misleading question because I guess the answer is, well, they haven't given us they're not providing the information for there to be evidence, but I'm suggesting that they are conducting a cover-up.
Well, look, Rob, I mean, throughout the last 20-something years, since the rise of the war on terrorism and the security state and, every last violation of everybody's privacy rights, what the feds have said to us over and over again is if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. That's been their
But I guess
mantra.
In this case, they've got a record of lying. And so it's like, why can't I have my search warrant? This guy's a known drug criminal. So there's actually a good reason to search his car. I guess that's kind of the...
Everything is flipped on its head here, right? Because everything's upside down. If you're claiming to live in a free society, then individuals have privacy rights. But government doesn't have privacy. That's government hiding things is secrecy. Free people hiding things is privacy. And it's totally different. And so the feds will look at us and make a mockery of privacy and go, if you've done nothing wrong, you should have nothing to hide. Yet what would be so much more reasonable would be for the American people to look at the feds and go, hey, if you've done nothing wrong, you got nothing to hide. You don't get to hide shit from us. Like you're supposed to be serving us, right? Isn't that hypothetically what this whole thing's supposed to be?
So you're almost saying government withholding evidence would be indicative of guilt.
Yes. I think it's not the same as individuals. I think that look, there's Tucker Carlson was talking about this the other night on a Twitter Spaces that he did. It was really great. But he was saying, look, there's over 1 billion classified documents. It's over 1 billion. And nobody in Washington, D.C. can argue to you with a straight face that that's because those all really need to be classified. This is ridiculous. It's all just like protecting themselves. That's all of this stuff. How can they justify that the Kennedy documents are still secret? Like what? Is there something that could give an advantage to the Soviet Union in there? Are there any of the conflicts that we had in the year 1963 still relevant at all today? The Soviet Union's gone. Fidel Castro's dead, right? Like there's nothing that they could even pretend but they still just won't let us know what happened. So yeah, is that evidence of guilt? I kind of think so. Yeah. Either way. Okay. So I mentioned Hunter and Vivek mentioned Hunter Biden there. So that's the next thing we got to address is there's been a Hunter sighting. And it comes in an interesting time. So basically right around the same time, the House officially voted to open an impeachment inquiry. For people who don't know, this is the first step in impeaching a president. The House opened an impeachment inquiry. They subpoenaed Hunter Biden, and Hunter Biden gave a speech. This is not something we've seen a lot of. There's been a lot of talk of Hunter Biden over the last 3 years or so. A little bit more than 3 years. But
a lot of brilliant artists are recluses, though, and
that is
making
true.
Millions of dollars on their paintings. Sometimes you just want to focus on what you love and embrace your personal process.
It's hard for the non-artistic types, such as ourselves, to understand the great artists when it comes to a Hunter or an Adolf. And these are the people who have to they've got to live in their art.
Fueled my struggle with addiction. They belittled my recovery, and they have tried to dehumanize me, all to embarrass and damage my father.
All right, let's pause that right here. So isn't this, Rob, as our people would say, the chutzpah is just unbelievable. So this is your whole, after one little throwaway line about also, I did some things wrong. I could have taken advantage of my opportunities better. But then he brags about his resume that he's so proud of. Like, hey, I got into Ivy League schools. Yeah, we all know that a senator's kid getting into Ivy League schools suggests nothing but meritocracy, right? So you're bragging. He brags about the boards of directors that he's on. Now, again, if you guys want to go through this, they're all clearly because he's a senator, then vice president's son. That's why he's on these boards. So it's just like, so, and then to just go off on what a victim he is, you know, I've been the victim of these horrible attacks. You know, I'm clearly a victim, the son of a senator, vice president, obviously one of the least privileged members of society. I made millions of dollars trading in my father's last name. But I'm even more of a victim than that because I also blew all of the money on drugs and hookers. So that's like, that just shows you what a disease I have. I'm in recovery here, sir. So you have no idea what it's like for me to be attacked for my blatant corruption. Try to put yourself in that situation, okay? It's very hard. You're basically like, I don't know, you're basically like a kid trapped in a war zone. Basically the same thing.
I respect the balls on this guy to not show up to a congressional hearing and instead be like, you know, just set up a podium outside and then set up the podium and go, how dare they look into me while I'm healing and recovering? And my God, I'm a respected board member of these companies. You know what gives you this kind of balls? Crack.
All right, let's keep playing.
Let me state as clearly as I can. My father was not financially involved in my business, not as a practicing lawyer, not as a board member of Burisma, not in my partnership with a Chinese private businessman, not in my investments at home nor abroad, and certainly not as an artist.
Right,
During my battle with addiction,
it's just great that it's unbelievable that he's forced, even in this self-righteous little speech, to run off the greatest hits. It doesn't matter what you put around it. It's just so obvious what that sounds like once you start saying it. He wasn't involved in this Ukrainian energy company that I happen to be raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars a month from, you know, the place where we're fighting a war in right now. Yeah, I was involved. I had serious financial interest there in the years leading up to the war. The Chinese government that I was making tons of money off, he wasn't involved in that. And the fact that I just started painting and then Democratic donors wanted to buy my paintings for obscene amounts of money. My dad wasn't a part of that. Like, okay. Still sounds like you're corrupt as shit, but all right.
In campaigning, everybody's mischaracterized and everybody distorts and demagogue and all this. But what issue or what have your opponents said or the media said that has mischaracterized you? Because you provided this 10 of them, but which is the one that they're really off base and trying to picture you as believing in something that you don't want any part of? Is there one thing?
Yeah, I think there's a long litany, but I would say one of the most recent is trying to sort of put into my mouth some of the things that I believe are hard facts about realities where the government has lied to us. So I've been pretty vocal about certain areas, Dr. Paul, where we know for a fact the government has lied. The government lied to us about Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11. They lied to us about the Trump-Russia collusion hoax that never was. They lied to us about the origin of COVID-19 and the role of the U.S. government in funding gain-of-function research abroad. They're lying to us now about how our money is being spent in Ukraine, about the truth of what happened and at least what is and is not known about January 6th. And in each of those cases, I've been tethered to facts. I'm not drawing some grand theory that isn't tied to existing facts, but pointing out what we now know to be true, compare that to what a government previously told us, and identifying a mismatch there. And I believe that's essential to rebuild trust in our country, is to say that here's the areas where the government, and in many cases the mainstream media, almost every case, along with the government, has lied to us. We have to acknowledge that to make sure that we don't repeat those same mistakes in the future.
Right.
I've been extra careful to be really tethered to the facts as I've done that. But of course, the media prefers to put words in my mouth that I never said as an effort to sort of create a caricature of it to avoid engaging with the substance of what I have pointed out. And I think that that's something that, you know, I think is predictable, but it takes somebody who is also able to cut through the nonsense to be able to get the actual facts.
Okay.
It was amazing, this recent town hall on CNN, you have to say. And when Abby Phillip was interviewing you, and everyone is talking about it, it just blew up Twitter, X. When you touched the third rail and said, as you just said, the government lies, the government lied about January 6th, and we need to know how many federal agents were in there. Yeah. And at that moment, the media took over and said, you're wrong, don't say that, don't say that. And it's just fascinating. I just would love to hear your view about the media as a gatekeeper, exposed at that moment, telling us what we can know and can't talk about.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I mean, when you're talking about certain topics, maybe they're okay with hearing dissenting views, but certain third rail topics, they lost their minds. Actually, I believe they ended the town hall 5 minutes earlier before the top of the hour, just to make sure that things were under control from their vantage point. So what I stated were some hard facts. What do we know? Several of the kidnappers in the Gretchen Whitmer plot, which actually began as a FBI informant sort of plan to storm the Michigan State Capitol, what began as became the Gretchen Whitmer plot, resulted in several people, these are just hard facts, acquitted at the end of that trial on grounds of government entrapment. That is to say, the government put people up to do something that those people otherwise wouldn't have done and then arrested them for it. That's not allowed in our constitutional republic. And those people were acquitted, so much so that one of the jurors even came up, apologized to one of the defendants, hugged him. And this was a major point that the media never reported on. I was talking about those facts on CNN. And then there's the fact that the head of the Detroit field office of the FBI became, under Christopher Wray's watch, Christopher Wray moved him in the fall of 2020 to become the field office director of the D.C. office, right about 3 months before January 6th happened. After which we now know that there were federal informants, if not agents, in the field. We haven't been told how many. We haven't been told how Capitol Police officers allowed people to enter the Capitol, including people who were arrested for then being present on the Capitol. And we had not been exposed to the full video footage, that the government had only released tiny slices of it without giving the public the whole picture. Everything I just told you is hard fact. But the experience that I had with Abby Phillips was she asked me a question so as to get credit. The question she asked was, you said January 6th was an inside job. Actually, on the debate stage, I said the evidence suggests increasingly like it's looking more and more like an inside job, which means entrapment. But she mischaracterized what I said. And then hearing me respond to it, started to cut me off every time I'm giving what I think she recognizes her audience would see as, oh, this is a reasonable response of facts he's giving me. I think that's what they fear more. I think if I was just spouting off unsupported conspiracy theory garbage nonsense that was unsupported, then I think that they would have been fine to let me go and then caricature me afterwards with a whole episode they could devote to fact-checking me. But in this case, I think they viewed it as far more dangerous to their agenda. When I'm offering just cold hard facts, I didn't raise my voice with her. I would say the same happened in return from her to me. But if somebody's cool-headedly laying out the facts, I think they find that far more threatening to their agenda rather than somebody who actually is just spouting off unsupported conspiracies.
Very good. Under the circumstances today, you follow that philosophy. If they hit us, we hit them hard, hit them real hard back. Because, modern technology allows them to hit us with a missile or with a drone. And how many of our American people, because they were on bases and things around the world, in so many places, and we've been hit 90 times. Boy, that's a job and a half. That's why I don't see how we can tinker with that. And I think, and I know you favor a lot of changes in foreign policy, but I don't see how this is solved as long as we're an empire. But what is your opinion? We
shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be in many of these places in the first place. That's the answer.
Do you think it's too strong for me to use the word empire?
I don't think it's too strong for you to use the word empire. I think that it's a psychology. It's almost a psychology of empire that I think has actually been what has plagued our foreign policy. And the ultimate irony in that is, as we're focused on the outer periphery of that psychological empire, we're actually weaker than we have been in a very long time right here at home. I favor strong homeland defenses, border defenses, super EMP, cyber attack defenses, missile defenses of our own homeland. That's where I think our national defense spending should be going, to defending our own homeland from external threats, rather than, and you could look at let's take a look at the Roman Empire. Well, it didn't do very well when they let the center and the core actual country rot, while they were focused more on the periphery. And so that's the way I look at this as well, is the irony is the very national security establishment that has been focused actually on offensive missions in the name of this psychological empire has actually left the homeland far more vulnerable and weaker than we have ever been, economically and otherwise. And I think that's going to change on my watch. We shouldn't be handing out foreign aid to countries whose national debt per person is less than ours, when we have a $34 trillion national debt problem right here at home. And so that's what I think, true America First principles, we have to define what that means. And to me, it comes back down to those two North Star principles I shared. The people who we elect to run the government should be the ones who actually run the government, a government that's accountable to its people, not the other way around. And that the moral duty of those U.S. leaders should be to the U.S. citizens, not to some other random foreign interest abroad. And George Washington, I think, would have said the same thing, and that's what I would say today.
Let's assume for now the senses are valid. The senses, however, are simply the beginning of knowledge. We must go on from there, and to this extent, says Aristotle, Plato was absolutely right. We must come to grasp universals, not merely sense particulars. We have to form concepts. We have to grasp common denominators in order to be able to classify and systematize our percepts and thereby make sense of the world. Plato, however, was wrong in his view of the process by which this is done. Remember, Plato thought that you had to have concepts in advance of coming in contact with particulars in order to be able to know how to group particulars. That was the argument I presented as argument 3, the argument from the order of knowledge. Aristotle says this is all wrong. Concepts, he says, can be grasped by a process of abstraction from particulars without any antecedent knowledge. And therefore, first you know particulars, and only subsequently do you know concepts. Nor do you need concepts in order to get them, as Plato claimed. The process, he says, is simple. Point A, you start with sense experience. Now, he says, in some cases, the living creature simply doesn't have the capacity to retain sense data, in which case it never gets any farther. It sees one sense datum and then it's gone, and it sees the next one, and that's all. Salmon are supposed to be like that. I don't know how anybody would know, but they're supposed to be that way. But he says in some living creatures, and certainly in men, they are able to remember past sense experiences. They have memory. They can retain their percepts. And thirdly, in the case of man, and man alone, they have not only sense and memory, but a third capacity. After a number of similar percepts are repeated, a man has the ability to detect common denominators among them. He has the ability to abstract, to concentrate selectively on the common denominators, ignoring the differences. And that is how we form concepts. We see one example of green, and another, and another, and at a certain point, if you're not too retarded, you get the message that there's something similar in those instances. Even if their shapes and locations and sizes differ, you focus in on the similar element and you form the concept green, and so on for all others. We don't need to know concepts in advance. At the outset, we are simply, said Aristotle, bombarded by sensory chaos. And at the beginning, we don't know. When the green thing hits us, we haven't a clue what it is. It's just something. We haven't any idea what. And if we could take this Aristotelian baby and somehow conduct a philosophic discussion with him and ask him, what is this? He'd say, I haven't the faintest clue. Whereas if you took a Platonist baby and asked him, he'd say, well, I don't know right yet, but I'm shortly going to know that it's green and it comes under color and so on and so on. Because I knew it all once, I just forgot it. So we don't need all that. All we have to postulate, says Aristotle, is the basic ability to be able to recognize similarities when they hit you in the face, and to grasp them when they confront you, and then abstract and ignore the differences. Every time we do so, we bring order into a certain range of our percepts. We form classifications by detecting identities among differences. And now if you ask Aristotle, but why? How come human beings have this kind of capacity? Aristotle answers the same answer as to why they have the senses or why they have memory. It is simply a fact. It is not a fact that philosophers should make mystical or try and explain away. His famous line in this respect is, quote, the soul is so constituted as to be capable of this process, unquote, and he proceeds about his business. Facts are facts, and they are not to be made mythology. Once, of course, you have now formed a given concept, that permits you to recognize and identify new instances of it when you encounter them. So the next time a little green thing comes by, you can now say, aha, I know what that is green. And this process, of course, continues on progressively more abstract levels. When you abstract from your abstractions, so you get green and red and so on, and then color, or man and animal and so on, and then living thing, or table, chair, and so on, and then furniture. And you go still wider. From furniture and art, for instance, you might abstract man-made object. And from rocks and tomatoes and mountains, you might abstract natural object. And by combining man-made and natural together, you get the widest, namely thing, primary substance. And in the other areas, you get action, quality, quantity, relationship. In other words, the categories, as he called them, are the widest universals. They're the climax at the end of the abstracting process. They're the widest abstractions in any area. In other words, we build up our conceptual apparatus by a process of successive abstraction, which enables us to classify facts that we observe, bring order out of the sensory chaos, identify facts now conceptually. So instead of being bombarded with unintelligible shapes and colors and sounds, we say, a man just died, a piece of ice just melted, etc. Now I insert here parenthetically Aristotle's answer to Plato on the question of perfection, because it's relevant. It can be easily discussed in connection with his view of abstraction. Remember argument, I think it was 2 as I gave it to you. We never encounter the perfect in this world, and therefore we must have got it from another world, our knowledge of it. E.g., all the beds in this world have something wrong with them, for instance, a lump. Well, Aristotle says, leaving aside every other argument you could use, why can't you just abstract away from the lump? Why can't you just find from your observations what is a bed and what is its function, and then grasp, okay, it has a lump, I'll ignore that, and say a perfect bed would be a bed just like this but without the lump. Why did you have to meet it in another dimension? And the same thing, of course, is true of lines which have a wiggle, even if it were true that every line has a wiggle. Human beings have the power of abstracting away from the wiggles. And as to Plato's view that, well, but for instance, there is no triangle in this world because a triangle is straight lines, and lines are only one-dimensional, and only the three-dimensional exists in this world, and therefore we must have encountered the one-dimensional in another dimension. We must have encountered the one-dimensional in the fourth dimension. Aristotle says that's false. The one-dimensional does exist in this world, but it doesn't exist apart from the other 2 dimensions. But the way to find it is simply focus selectively. Take any surface and ignore its extension and just focus on the extension in one dimension. And there is the real one-dimensional, exactly as real as color is real. Only it doesn't exist floating free, but neither does color. So why do we need another dimension for that? In other words, if you can abstract, you can abstract.
Just before leaving town for Christmas break, the U.S. House gave Americans a last-minute holiday gift. a nearly $1 trillion military spending bill filled with lots of goodies for the special interests and the military-industrial complex. Unfortunately, the rest of America got nothing but coal in its stockings. With constitutionalists like Representative Thomas Massie on the House Rules Committee, Speaker Johnson made the unusual move to bringing the National Defense Authorization Act under suspension of the rules, which bypasses the Rules Committee but requires 2/3 of the House to pass the bill. Considering that Speaker Johnson tossed into the must-pass bill yet another extension of Section 702 of the FISA Act, it's unsurprising that he wanted to rush the bill through without the possibility of amendment. Section 702 allows the government to intercept and retain without a warrant the communications of any American who is in contact with a non-U.S. citizen. It is clearly a violation of the Fourth Amendment, which is supposed to protect Americans against unreasonable searches and seizures. Section 702 was legalized under President George W. Bush during the War on Terror after it was revealed that Bush was using the National Security Agency to illegally spy on Americans. We were told at the time that government must be granted these authorities because we were under threat from terrorists. It would just be a temporary measure, we were promised, and then the authority would expire. That was 15 years ago, and here we are, reauthorizing the government to continue to violate our liberties. As with the rest of the violations of our civil liberties after 9/11, like the Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA, the federal government soon turned its terrorism-fighting tools inward, targeting Americans rather than foreigners who we were told wanted to harm Americans. That's why the FBI's so-called domestic terrorism watch list continues to expand to include Christians and those skeptical of big government. So rather than debating whether we want a government more like East Germany than the one our founders imagined, Section 702 was tossed into the military spending bill. The NDAA also contained a $600 million gift to the corrupt government of Ukraine. As opposition to further spending on Ukraine's failed war with Russia's increases in the House, Republican leadership decided to add what may be the last parting gift to the military-industrial complex. As with most foreign assistance, however, Ukraine will likely see very little of this money. Most of it will be laundered through the military contractors and lobbyists who line every corner of the Beltway. The NDAA also pushes us further toward confrontation with China, authorizing more than $100 million to train Taiwan's military and a further $9 billion to continue sending U.S. military ships to harass China in its backyard. I believe Speaker Johnson is intelligent with a bright future in House leadership. He has inherited a broken system and a legislative body that operates without any guiding principle. I sincerely hope he will begin to listen to the increasing voices in the House who are questioning the warfare-welfare state. We are more than $33 trillion in debt, with interest payments on that debt dwarfing all other government spending. A crash is coming. There is no time for more business as usual. Thanks for listening.
So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin met with Israeli officials in Tel Aviv on Monday and vowed continued U.S. military support for the Israeli onslaught on Gaza, despite the massive civilian casualty rate. So in a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Austin said that the U.S. commitment to Israel is unshakable. He said, quote, "America's commitment to Israel is unwavering, and no individual group or state should test our resolve," end quote. Austin vowed that the U.S. would continue to provide Israel with the equipment that it needs, referring to the bombs that the U.S. has been shipping there and other military equipment. And the Pentagon has said that these arms shipments have continued on a near daily basis since October 7th. U.S. officials have said that they want Israel to wrap up the current phase of the war, which involves the constant airstrikes and the ground campaign. They want them to finish that in the next few weeks and then take a more targeted approach against Hamas, a more limited attack. Austin said that the U.S. had thoughts about more surgical operations, but he made clear the timeline of the onslaught, the timeline of the operations is up to Israel. Austin said, quote, regarding the timeline, this is Israel's operation, and I'm not here to dictate timeline or terms. Our support to Israel's right to defend itself is ironclad, as you've heard me say a number of times, and that's not going to change, end quote. So at a press conference with Austin, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that the Israeli military would continue to operate in different levels of intensity, which is how he put it. And they'll do that as they see fit and will eventually transition gradually into the next phase of the war. So when discussing civilian casualties, Austin said, quote, protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral duty and a strategic imperative, end quote. But he also gave cover for Israeli slaughter of civilians, saying that the population density in Gaza makes it very, very difficult for the Israeli operations. So if he's saying it's a moral duty to protect Palestinian civilians, that means that the U.S. should not be supporting what Israel's doing in Gaza. So, they say one thing on one hand about civilian casualties, but the truth is they don't really care because they're still providing all this support that Israel relies on. And so the U.S. has formally announced the launch of a new military operation in the Red Sea aimed at responding to attacks on commercial shipping by Yemen's Houthis that started in response to the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the initiative dubbed Operation Prosperity Guardian while on a trip to the region and said that the other countries taking part include the UK, Bahrain, Canada, France, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, the Seychelles, and Spain. So Bahrain, the only Arab country in there that is joining in so far. The Houthi attacks have forced some of the world's largest shipping lines to suspend Red Sea transits, which is going to have a big impact on the global economy. The British energy giant BP announced on Monday that it was stopping all shipments of oil and gas through the water. So that's another huge company saying that they're not going to sail through there anymore. So the Houthis, known as Ansar Allah, have vowed to target all ships heading to and from Israel and said the only way to restore calm to the region is through a lasting ceasefire in Gaza. The Houthis have shown no sign of backing down, and they announced on Monday that they launched 2 drone attacks on commercial vessels. So the attacks continue, and the U.S. is considering taking military action. It's not clear exactly what this big naval task force is going to do. I guess they're going to be there to try to intercept missiles and drones, as U.S. warships have already been doing that. But now they've formally announced this new military operation. So there's an interesting report in Bloomberg that said that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are split on how the U.S. should respond. So the U.S. has backed the Saudi-UAE coalition against the Houthis since 2015. The Saudis and the UAE kind of back different players in this war. The Saudis back the so-called internationally recognized government that's been exiled from Yemen. I mean, they have some control of some territory on the ground, but not much. And then you have the UAE, who backs the Southern Transition Council, which wants to separate what used to be South Yemen from what used to be North Yemen. So anyway, apparently the UAE wants the U.S. to take direct military action against the Houthis and redesignate them as a foreign terrorist organization, which would make the peace deal between the Saudis and the Houthis, it would be impossible to implement. And then the Saudis fear that military action against the Houthis could provoke more attacks, and they're worried that their oil facilities would start coming under attack again. That was a big reason why the Saudis decided to make peace with the Houthis, was they got really good at hitting their oil facilities, and they don't want that to happen again. So it's just interesting to see the divide here. And I mean, who knows? This just doesn't seem like it's going in a good direction. Things are going to escalate in some way. I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow the U.S. bombed Yemen, or we wake up and that's the news. I feel like it might only be a matter of time before the U.S. does that, and then who knows what could happen. White House said on Monday that a weapons package will be provided to Ukraine later this month, and after that, the U.S. will be out of funds to arm Ukraine until Congress authorizes more spending on the proxy war. So the Pentagon still has $4.4 billion in presidential drawdown authority, which allows the U.S. to send weapons to Ukraine straight from military stockpiles. So they have $4.4 billion left in that. But the issue is, according to the White House, that they're going to run out of funding needed to replenish the arms being sent. So they can't replace the stuff that they're sending over there, and they've sent so much to Ukraine that they can't spare much more. So Mike McCord, who's the Pentagon's comptroller, he made Congress aware of the situation in a letter that he sent on Sunday. So John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, said, quote, "We are still planning one more aid package to Ukraine later this month. However, when that one's done, as the comptroller, Mr. McCord, made clear in his note to Congress today, we will have no more replenishment authority available to us, and we're going to need Congress to act without a delay, as we have been saying," end quote. So the Biden administration wants over $60 billion for Ukraine and has been pleading with Congress to approve this big $111 billion military aid package that it's requested. The Republicans are still holding out for a border deal, but they just continue to make these pleas to Congress really sound like they're begging. So it's not clear when this Ukraine aid will be approved. I think, unfortunately, that it probably will be eventually, because the Republicans are not saying, I mean, some Republicans that are against funding the war in Ukraine, but Republican leadership, and it seems like for the most part, Republicans are saying, give us this border deal, then we'll give you whatever you want in Ukraine.
Life insurance actuaries are finding that more people are continuing to die at alarming rates, even more than before the pandemic, that cannot be accounted for by COVID. Of course, there's an attempt to suggest that this is because of COVID, but plainly, and that was even evident in that legacy media reporting, it isn't COVID, but it's contemporaneous with COVID. So can you remember anything else happening? Just let's work on this as a planet together. At the time of COVID, did anything else happen that could have a massive deleterious impact on human health? I don't know, we just have to look at clues. Did any major organizations, for example, demand indemnity from legal prosecution? That would be a clue, because that would point, I think, if anyone said you can't publish any information for 75 years, these kind of things would all be clues. So let's all just together, like Scooby-Doo and the gang, have a look and see if there's any information. For instance, the Society of Actuaries Research Institute found that there was a 34% increase in deaths among working-age people, 35 to 44, in the last quarter of 2022. Because they're not an at-risk group from COVID, are they? That's not comorbidities, that's not elderly, that's not respiratory conditions, that's working-aged people. 34% is sort of unthinkable. If that happened and there wasn't something being concealed, this would be headline news. If this was a story that could be used to say, and therefore everyone better start carrying an ID card, or therefore everyone better remain in their homes, it's because of climate change. We found that because of fossil fuel fumes in the air, 34% of people are dying. Get in your house, give us your car, you will own nothing and be happy. They would be on it. So it's something that's not being investigated. Isn't this extraordinary? Another clue would be, I suppose, if there was a particular industry that paid a lot of money to news media and their advertising, that would be good. Someone should look into that as well. Also, were there any subjects that were heavily censored, where true information was censored? These are all breadcrumbs out of this forest of death and lies. Many of them are working age people who are in the prime of their life, not anymore, who are suffering deaths from cardiac and neurological disorders. However, the CDC and public health agencies are at a loss to explain these statistics, nor is there any apparent urgency on their part to get to the bottom of the crisis. Well, we'd have to look to see if the CDC has any financial relationships with any other industries. Just keep putting all these clues together. Hopefully the COVID inquiry in the UK will get to the bottom of this, or when Anthony Fauci is, for example, being interviewed by the legacy media, he'll help us because, after all, he is science. The phenomenon is not confined to the US. In the UK, deaths among 20 to 44-year-olds in the first quarter of 2023 were similar to the same time frame in 2021 at the peak of the COVID deaths and above baselines for the years before the pandemic. That's interesting, isn't it? Because 2023, there is no pandemic. 2021, the height of the pandemic. So at the height of the pandemic, the same number of people died now after the pandemic, and yet the pandemic's not there anymore. So something's causing at least that many deaths, even though the pandemic is over. What could it be? In Australia, excess deaths in 2022 were 12% higher than previous years, with 1/3 of those deaths considered non-COVID related. Number of excess deaths in the last 12 months. As of May 21, 2023, the US had over 103,000, Germany had 83,000, France had 17,600, UK had 55,000, Brazil 60,000, Russia 72,000, and Italy 25,650. We did an interview recently with Steve Kirsch exclusively over on Rumble because we were cautious about putting it anywhere else because it pertained to the data breach in New Zealand with the data that was specifically stolen by Barry Young, who some are calling the Edward Snowden of the pandemic. I urge you to have a look at that data that pertained, of course, to certain medical measures that took place during that period, because when you see numbers of this size, the information that even I was somewhat incredulous and certainly skeptical about starts to make sense. I urge you to have a look at that video on our channel. It's worth recalling the comments from January 2022 by Scott Davison, CEO at one of Indiana's life insurance companies. We are seeing right now the highest death rates we've seen in the history of this business, not just at One America. The data is consistent across every player in the business. So this is data that's not actually even coming from medical analysis, but from insurance companies. So it's only when it started becoming financially relevant. Wait a minute, we can't keep insuring everyone. Everyone's dying. Well, put up the premiums, the idiots. They're also poor because the economy collapsed around the same time, almost as if something happened that was beneficial to rich people, reduced the population, limited the ability of ordinary people to communicate. This is just so baffling. Just raise the premiums and let this thing sort itself out. If people were just all of a sudden dying because of some novel new agent, there would be footage from across the world of people passing out, collapsing, dying, banging their head that we would all be able to put together and look at as kind of evidence that something unprecedented and historic had taken place. Here it is.
Comedian Heather McDonald collapsed over the weekend during a show.
Management saying she suffered a skull fracture in the fall.
The CDC has confirmed
higher than normal cases
of heart inflammation in 16 to 24-year-olds.
Service members later developed myocarditis.
You take all of the vaccines since 2010 and you compare 2021, this thing blows through the roof.
Experts say more and more younger women are suffering from stroke.
Sorry, Aaron, I'm not feeling very well right now.
80% of the cases have been in young boys.
I am in the hospital with heart complications from the COVID-19 vaccine.
The 14-year-old's heart stopped.
A 15-year-old boy died
after saving his
his first dose.
16-year-old was rushed to the hospital. Loved ones say the 17-year-old's heart stopped.
The elite runner was rushed to the hospital after suffering a heart
High school
attack.
football player has died just hours after getting his second
Dose of COVID vaccine.
After collapsing on the football field.
collapsing in the middle of the game.
Collapsing during the game.
Collapsing on the tennis court.
Suddenly collapsing.
The player
Collapsed and died.
After collapsing.
He collapsed.
It seems that there's a second player who's collapsed.
This is unusual.
Never seen anything like this. Yeah, what's going on?
Yeah, what's happening?
It is now well established that the mRNA vaccines cause heart inflammation.
That's very disturbing to watch, so we have to ensure that we stay away from crackpots and conspiracy theorists, and I think we'll be relatively safe in the hands as we continue to investigate of Dr. Pierre Corey, MD, President and Chief Medical Officer at the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. This is what he wrote. Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Robert Califf recently took to X to mourn the catastrophic decline in US life expectancy. But his post, which on smoking, diet, chronic illness and healthcare, ignored the obvious. People are dying in abnormally high numbers even now and long since COVID-19 waned. Yet public health agencies and medical societies are silent. That's what's peculiar about this, isn't it? Remember earlier, 34% increase in the age range of 35 to 44-year-old working people. That's astonishing, and you can bet that if it was something that could be used to legitimize further regulation or control of a population, or to levy some tax, or to legitimize some new measure, or allow censorship or surveillance on new ID cards, it will be examined. Why are they not looking at this? These are just normal statistics. We're not making this stuff up. So what's happening? What's being concealed? What's not being reported? Is it possible that the government, the legacy media and Big Pharma are working together so extensively that they can essentially manage reality? The shared public reality only includes data that is permissible. And when people try to intervene and give you alternative narratives, those people are removed one way or another. Life insurers have been consistently sounding the alarm over these unexpected or excess deaths, which claimed 158,000 more Americans in the first 9 months of 2023 than in the same period in 2019. That exceeds America's combined losses from every war since Vietnam. Congress should urgently work with insurance experts to investigate this troubling trend. So in the first 9 months of 2023, America's excess deaths accumulate to more than all of the deaths of American soldiers and military personnel in every single war since Vietnam. Think of all the parades and reporting and consternation and doubt as a result of the Afghanistan war, the Korea war, the Iraq wars, the current conflicts around the world. Doesn't that suggest that there should be some sort of inquiry, investigation, parade, special day, few minutes silence, accountability? What's going on?
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
All right. Let's take a look at some more topics for today. Let's start with let's go with the latest in Ukraine. We're recapping all the news from last week, so we're going to go quick here. We don't pontificate like they do on the Part of the Problem podcast, 15, 20-minute segments. We're quick here. You get 2 minutes of information. It's a broad stroke, and you're left more confused. That's the way we handle things over here for all these new Twitter commentators. EU membership talks with Ukraine, a direct pivot from the current strategy of paying to get their soldiers killed. All right, yeah, okay, fine. These are my own notes. I didn't have to read that out loud. That shouldn't even be there. Dude, I don't quite understand what's going on in the Ukraines. It seems like they would like to try and negotiate this thing down, and so everyone's looking for maximum leverage. And so while we're not sending additional funds over there, we're trying to weasel out of getting additional funds. Now they're going back to NATO conversations or EU membership conversations, which I guess is to, poke back at Putin, who is going, nope, I won this thing, so I'm going to exert my maximum leverage over here. I'm enjoying that Putin's going like full force with I will not leave this until Ukraine is denazified, because there's no way that we can allow him to make an official statement of I have denazified what the Americans and the Europeans were supporting. But who knows? Maybe Zelensky's got to turn over all the Nazis that he's been working with, and then they can finally call it a war. What are your guys' predictions at this point? Do we think we're coming to the end? Do you think it's as it's an election season, we can't continue to send money over there? We have to finally realize and accept our losses, and realizing that, there's no way to convince the American people that Putin's going to go and take all of Europe, and there aren't too many more Ukrainians that we can even get killed? Or do you think we're in this in the end, and 20 years from now, there's still just going to be a little bit of a fight going on the Ukraine border? You guys are in the chat. You can tell me what you think. Next is we've got the impeachment inquiry is ramping up. You had Biden. He didn't show up. I find the whole thing has been boring to me. It's like, yeah, just give me the firm evidence already about how, China's been bribing the Biden family and how Joe Biden's been directly involved. And, it's taken a long time of teasing that they were going to go after these people, that they were going to actually start impeachment proceedings, which would give them better access to all of the presidential financials. And then they'd finally be able to bust the guy for what they say has already been blatant financial crimes. You got to quit teasing the story. I need some closure here. I can't keep constantly living my life in this soap opera that seasons are going to come to a conclusion that they never do. I think that was a Tim Dillon thing about that. We all see this, like there's going to be conclusions, and then there just aren't they never actually come to a conclusion. Pre-election, the interest rate is going down. You guys loading up on bonds before we move away from this 5.5% interest rate? Do you think that inflation was over? Do you think that the government can start pumping monies back into these things, sending the stocks back to the moon, sending the bitcoins back to the moon? They're going to reverse from quantitative tightening back to the quantitative easing. Hey, listen, we need this economy to be booming. And so I don't know. I guess they're going to go. They're already talking about maybe 3, 4, 5 interest rate cuts next year. Do you guys actually believe that inflation has tamed, has cooled itself to a point that they can get themselves back into some inflating up some bubbles? Where do you guys think that is going? That was I thought they were going to continue tightening a little bit. I thought that inflation had made its way to the mainstream, where people were actually talking about it, where it might even be a contentious point in the elections of, hey, look at all the things that you've done, look at all the money that you've spent, and look at how people, our common people, can't afford things because you're robbing them through inflation. But we're reversing course. I guess they want a hot economy coming into the election season, and they don't care if we end up seeing more, I guess what they'll claim once again is just temporary inflation. We're back. Next is this dude. Israel seems to be they seem to have just outright lost the press war. It seems like everything down to the New York Times, to the Wall Street Journal, everyone's turning around and going, hey, listen, we were trying to have your back, but what's going on here is a little bit too aggressive, and I'm sorry, but we're going to have to report on it. And so you got Blinken over there saying he's working on Israel with their New Year's resolution to kill less civilians. He had these articles that they were just dropping these dumb bombs. They're pretending like they got leaflets, like they're targeting specific assets because they think they're worthwhile because of all the terrorists are there. And then you find out, I think they're just indiscriminately bombing. I thought the most damning thing that came out last week, we did talk about this on the Part of the Problem podcast, but it was in the New York Times where they were talking about that Israel has been sending cash to Hamas. And the reason that they were sending the cash to the Hamas people is, I guess the concept was that if the leadership was at least able to have enough cash on hand to run their daily affairs, pay off this guy, pay off that guy, keep a school open, show up, have meetings, and do all these things, well, then they would basically be able to bribe them into peace. Hey, listen, you guys can remain in charge. Your leadership can have your money. Everybody wins. To me, this is the most damning thing I've heard, because the whole Israel storyline was we can't send any assets. We can't work with these people. They're a terrorist organization. And we hand them water. They're going to turn their tubes into missiles for us. And so while that's going on, you're actually working with the leadership and you're handing them the most fungible of all items. You're handing them cash. You're handing cash to the leadership while pretending like any resources you make available to the area will be instantly seized by that same leadership and not allowed to be used by the citizens. Seems pretty damning. Israeli hostages mistakenly killed by IDF were waving white flag. But the Israeli army, they went, oh, look, civilians. How many civilians? I mean, how bad is the Israeli army at not killing civilians if they managed to kill their own hostages who were waving white flags at them? Sounds to me like whatever your protocols and procedures are for trying not to kill civilians must be pretty bad if you manage to kill your own hostages who were there waving white flags at you. Rudy Giuliani ordered to pay $148 million to defamed election workers. How are election workers worth this much money? How is it possible that claiming that anything that went wrong in an election can get someone damages? How much profits are in, I guess, working at elections, that saying that you did a bad job with the elections can get someone $148 million? I'd like to know. What is the Dominion contract worth that they were able to get $1 billion or whatever that judgment was from Fox News? What was it, $1.2 billion or something? Or in this case, $148 million? I got to get myself insurance and maybe start taking what I say a little bit more carefully, because everyone's turning around going, I was defamed. We live in a world now where everyone cares about everyone's feelings so much that they go, oh my God, you were home sad because someone made statements about you. And then somehow, I guess you get your friends to call you up and make threats. You got to have some threats in there. You want a good payment, you're going to have to come up with some threats. Also, Rudy Giuliani said so much nonsense the entire time. Who was actually who was actually convinced by Rudy Giuliani's words that they were harassing these two people to the extent that they were actually awarded damages of $148 million?
Well, hi, Merry Christmas. So glad you could come.
Gee, it is a surprise, too. Wonderful. Merry Christmas, everybody. Guess who's with me today? It's my wife, Carol. She said I couldn't do that without her. But I thought I'd just tell our viewers and our supporters a little bit about our Christmas, because it's it's turning out real well this year because we have a bigger celebration and a bigger family. And as you might notice, we have a lot of people here. And this was a nice room that we have. We've been fortunate to have it because one of Carol's orders when she says, if we ever get a house, and not too many years ago, a long time after I got out of Congress and all, we built a house. And she said, I need a big room because I want to be able to seat everybody in the room at one time. Well, back then, I think the number was around 40, but now it could be, how many now might we have for Christmas?
Well, 51, I think.
51 and counting. You know why we're counting is,
yes.
well, we have somebody coming, a new one?
We have a grandson that's going to be born, it's due like the day before Christmas. So we're hoping that we do get him here for Christmas.
Right. So and also we have one that a new member of the family that was 1 year old. So it'll be his first Christmas. Yes, that he's aware of. So it's been nice. But we do have a large family, and it's really a grand time because there was a time in the early years that a lot of people lived close by and they were in and out all the time. There still are a lot of people in and out because we have several generations involved. But they have to come from far distances. So who's coming from the furthest distance to make it to the Christmas?
Probably Rand from Washington.
Yeah, well, he also lives outside of Washington on half the time.
That's
and that'd be from Kentucky. Yeah. Kentucky. Yeah. So that's and then also we have another son physician that we don't see as often as the rest, but he comes rather frequently, and that's Robert. And he's coming from
Robert
where?
Had news when he said he was coming. He announced that we'll have another great grandbaby
That's
in
right.
July.
It's a really nice time as far as I'm concerned when we have the gathering together. Some of them, they're all athletically inclined, but they are very competitive. And most of the time, the competition, what I get a charge out of is people saying, well, how are you going to handle the discussion? People get together. Are they going to argue about religion and politics? And I keep thinking, that's the last thing that's ever been on my mind, even though they're my two favorite subjects. But in this house, at Christmas time, it'll be competitive. But it might be competitive in ping pong. It might be competitive, what they're going to play.
Rand wanted the new game.
The paddle ball?
Yeah, some kind of paddle ball.
No, he's very competitive. Rand's very competitive. And he'll be here, and he'll have a couple of his boys here. So,
and they're competitive,
right?
And the ones we have here are competitive.
Well, we really wanted to share our experience in our home with our supporters for the Liberty Report. That's been so important. And Carol is always anxious to meet more. We can't meet them all, but we have had some of our Liberty Report meetings here because it's convenient for us. So that has happened on quite a few occasions. And she's in charge then. So. It's always a good time, but I think of the Christmas time as being very, very good. And we've had, there's a lot of church going, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, that most or all will be attending church at the time, trying to remember the real essence of what Christmas is all about, and that will be fine with all of us.
Well, our daughter, Joy, wanted us to stop by their house and visit their church, so we'll have a busy Christmas Eve, and all kids will come around to get the festivities started.
Right. So, well, this has been a wonderful opportunity for us because Carol once in a while gets behind on her Christmas cards. Last year there were some mechanical or family matters, and she was a little slow last year, so I had to lecture her. But she did much better this year. But I said, if we do a little hello and a happy and Merry Christmas to our supporters, and believe me, these are key supporters. These are the people that come visit almost every day when we have a program. And that's why it's real nice for us to reach out because, she's pretty good at sending out those cards and all, but she might miss one or two. And we may need some, an effort to make sure everybody knows that we're very interested because the people that support us become our very good friends. And we, once again, want to wish them a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Same too. Yes. So, and thanks for listening today. Come back soon.
Now then, let's continue. Let us suppose we have acquired a certain conceptual apparatus. We're able to discover a host of particular facts. Is this the end of knowledge or science? No, says Aristotle, that's actually just the beginning. Because the goal of knowledge, he says, is to understand, to explain, to find out why things happen as they do, to see their necessity. The goal of science, says Aristotle, is to reach the stage where you would be amazed if anything were different than the way it was. Now, when you start and you're ignorant, everything is a big surprise to you. You're amazed that some of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, or that all men are mortal, etc. You can't figure out why that is. By the time you acquire enough knowledge of geometry or mathematics or biology, you would be amazed if anything else took place. And that, says Aristotle, is the goal. In other words, to get to the stage where you know the two crucial things, as he puts it, the that and the why, the facts and the causes which make them what they are, the causes that explain them. Well, but that raises the question, what will you take as an explanation? What is the cause of a thing's having the characteristics and behavior that it does? So we have to look at Aristotle's theory of explanation, which in turn depends upon his metaphysics. Before we can look for causes, we have to know what, in fact, are the causes of the actions of things. What makes things act as they do? For instance, if you believe in an all-powerful God as the source of everything, you will then say explanation must be theological. It must be this happened because God willed it. That would be the Christian viewpoint. Or, if with Plato you believe that the form of the good inspires everything and it's the ultimate cause, then your explanation will have to be in terms of the striving of everything for the form of the good. Now, since Aristotle denies any supernatural realm, his viewpoint is things act as they do because of what they are, because of their nature, because of the kinds of things they actually are in reality. Why does this particular thing boil when you raise it to a certain temperature? Because, for instance, it's water, not sand. Why does this one explode? Because it's gunpowder, not paper. Why does this one fly? Because it's a bird, not a teaspoon. In other words, what a thing basically or essentially is determines its characteristics and its behavior. And to explain any particular thing, therefore, we must know to what class does it belong. What are its essential characteristics? And thus we reach the question, how will we discover the essential characteristics, the essence of each class of things? How will we find out what makes water water, or what makes a man a man? What methodology will we take to answer these questions, and thereby tell us how to find the essence of each class, and thereby explain all the other characteristics? Well, by asking how to find the essence, we have reached another theory of Aristotle's, his theory of definition. Because Aristotle's definition of definition is, a definition is the statement of the essence of a class. In other words, it is the statement of those fundamental characteristics which make the class what it is and differentiate it from all other types of thing in the universe. For Aristotle, it is urgent, vital, crucial to discover correct definitions of every concept, because these definitions tell you the essence of something, which therefore permits you to understand why it behaves as it does. Well then, how do you arrive at correct definitions? Now, Aristotle wrote a great deal on this subject. He had many crucial things to say. This evening, I can just give you a brief sample. For instance, he said, all definitions must have a certain structure. The structure must consist of two parts. Suppose, for instance, you want to define man. First, you must state the general kind of thing he is. He is an animal. And that gives you the basic, the fundamental kind of thing he is. What you've done then is place man in a wider general class. And that class is known as the genus, G-E-N-U-S, from which we get our word general. Or what is a triangle? It is a plane figure. What is a church? It is a building. What is capitalism? It is a political system, etc. Now, but obviously, the genus is not enough, because there are other members of the same genus. And there are other types of plane figure, other types of building, etc. Therefore, we have to add a further element specifying how the thing we're defining differs from everything else within the genus. Man, for instance, we say is an animal with the capacity to reason. And that's what distinguishes him from the apes and the bumblebees. A triangle is a plane figure, but is bounded by three straight lines, as against circles and squares, and so on. Now, the phrase which represents what's distinctive within the genus is called the differentia, from which we get our word differentiate. Now, if you have these two, and if you have chosen them correctly, says Aristotle, you must have reached the essence of the class. The genus guarantees that you are stating the basic fundamental kind of thing it is. The differentia guarantees that you've stated something that's true only of this class, that you've differentiated it from all others. So the two together must have given you the essence of the class. It must have told you what it is, in a fundamental way, distinct from all other classes.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Coffee's going to be out in a little bit.
And we wanted to get you the information coming out so you could be on top of the trends and ahead of the news. And the news is when you listen to Lloyd Austin, the guy that's playing now a defense contractor, or excuse me, defense secretary. He used to work for the defense contractor. He used to work for Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor in the United States. So he goes over to Israel. And yesterday he meets with Netanyahu. And he said, the U.S.'s commitment to Israel is unshakable. America's commitment to Israel is unwavering. And no individual group or state should test our resolve. Hey, wait a minute. No individual? How about go fuck yourself? Who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? I'm an American citizen. I don't have a right to disagree with you and America's policy that's murdering people all over Gaza and in the West Bank. This is America? Oh, I forgot you work for Raytheon. I forgot you slaughtered people in Iraq as a general. Yeah, war based on lies brought to you by another piece of shit, little Billy Clinton. Billy Clinton, no, I forgot him, excuse me. He gave us the first Iraq slaughterings. I forgot little Georgie Bush. One murderer after another. Yep. So the cover of the Trends Journal says it all for this Christmas season. Prince of Peace? No peace on earth. Merry Christmas? Screw you. Go to hell. Hey, how are Christmas sales doing? F you to the Prince of Peace. I'm Lloyd Austin. I'm little Biden boy. I'm little Lindsey Graham. Ladies, look, how fucking stupid can you be to listen to these people? Austin goes on. He vowed that the U.S. could continue to provide Israel. You ready? This is the guy. Take off your mask. You take it off now. You're standing up. You're 6 feet apart. You can take your mask off. Okay. Don't. Hello, everybody. Here I am. And you put your mask back on, everybody. Oh, by the way, they're selling the COVID scare again. COVID's coming back. New variant. You better watch out. He goes on to say that the United States would continue to provide Israel, quote, with the equipment that you need to defend your country. Huh. Defend your country? Hey, how about this? What just happened today over there in Israel, bombing away and killing, that picture up of killing over 100 Palestinians. Look at this. Look at this. Oh, right to defend yourself? How about go fuck off? Oh, you're getting Hamas? Who the fuck you talking to? You're slaughtering 100 innocent people over here. And as we keep saying, as the dollar dies, the future is paved with gold. And, they're bragging about, Christmas sales are going up and everything. This is week 66. Take a trip on Route 66. Yep, that's what music used to be, music. Almost 40% of companies will cut staff in 2024. 66 weeks we've been going over this. Store size is shrinking. Article just came out today about all the people shopping online, and Generation Z, Gen Z, and the ones that are coming before them, or after them, I should say. They're addicted to online. They're going to go more and more online. So what do? How do you profit from this? Because there are profit opportunities, and we notice that. We note that. Yeah, The Walking Dead. That's who this become. And then we have what rents are going down. Wonder why and where. And again, the office building bust that nobody's talking about that's going to bring down the banking system. Corporate bankruptcies rise by double digits. No shit. Blow me away. Would have never known it by listening to the clowns, the prostitutes on the media that brainwash you with crap, or reading the toilet paper record or the Wall Shit Journal. But you get it with your Trends Journal. And speaking of variety of evils, UN rights chief, quote, extensive failure by Russia to protect Ukraine civilians. Yep, this guy, Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said on Tuesday that he's monitoring what they call, that his office monitoring indicated, quote, gross violations of international human rights laws, serious violations of international humanitarian law, and war crimes. primarily by the forces of the Russian Federation. He's 100% right. Terrible. And according to the numbers by Turk, 10,000 civilian deaths in Ukraine and 560 children. And now the numbers in Gaza. Let's see. Since October 7th, almost 20,000 Palestinians, including 7,500 children. But don't worry about it, because Zelensky said that he has no worries. The United States is going to send more money to keep the war going as our country goes down the crapper.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
All right, big news. Everyone's all fascinated. From the BBC, U.S. judge orders names of more than 170 Jeffrey Epstein associates to be released. And we're all getting excited. Everyone's like, hey, what happened to all those names? You had a case with that lady, and she went to jail, and we don't know any of these associates. And everyone's been getting excited. We've been hearing about these associates the whole time. And let me tell you, this associate thing, it's not the interesting storyline. The interesting storyline is what the hell happened to that safe. The FBI took in a safe that was in the guy's office, had all the blackmail tapes. I'm just claiming that. I don't actually know what was on them. And then it just, it just disappears. The FBI goes out, we lost it. We made sure to get that out of there, and we just managed to lose what could have been the most important piece of evidence in all of American history. It's just lost. We don't even know what happened to it. And now everyone's getting all excited for the associate list. But I'd like to know, what the fuck is an associate list? What does that mean? Like, you're going to have everyone going, yeah, I was associated because I was the napkin person at one of his dinner parties. Or I was involved in when he was doing the actual saving thing, when he was making the money to give it to the people who were going to get the Nobel Peace Prize awards. That's all I was involved in. This is from ABC News. The documents might not make clear why a certain individual became associated with Jeffrey's lawsuit, whatever that lady's name was, but more than 150 people are expected to be identified in hundreds of files that may expose more about Epstein's sex trafficking of women and girls in New York, New Mexico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and elsewhere. Some of the names may have simply been included in depositions, emails, or legal documents. But who knows, maybe we'll have fun. Maybe we'll be able to show up to all sorts of random places, show up shirts and go, what exactly was your association with Jeffrey Epstein? And all right, listen, everyone's in a whole up in arms. You know, you got this case out in Colorado where they're going, Donald Trump can't be on the ballot because he engaged in an insurrection. We've covered this on the show before. This is not breaking news. If you're a fan of the Run Your Mouth podcast and you enjoy living in the future and celebrating being right, we've covered this one before. I've let you know about this. They were using that language of insurrection sneakily from the beginning of this thing because they knew if they were able to convince enough people that this was an aspect of an insurrection, they might be able to say that Donald Trump is not eligible to run for president again. And they're doing everything they can to make sure that voters can't vote for Donald Trump, trying to convince you that he's got nuclear documents in his house, trying to wrap him up in this lawsuit, that lawsuit. Jack Smith, they're going after him in every which direction. It would seem to me like this was going to go to the Supreme Court, and it's not going to stick around. That's just my guess. I can't say for sure. Haven't read all the nooks and crannies on this guy, but there are some variables. And one is there was a similar court case that I believe we talked about on the show recently. I believe it was in Michigan, and that one got thrown out. So I don't know why the Supreme Court in Denver came to a different conclusion. I also don't know why any of us feel like we live in a free country with a just justice system where it all just seems to be some game about whether or not you get more judges that are on your side than are on the other side. So I guess it goes up to the Supreme Court. Donald Trump is lucky that he got more Republicans on the thing in the last one, so it likely side in his favor. In Colorado, you got more liberal justices, wasn't in his favor. What a system. If you can just, get enough of your people into it, doesn't matter what the law is. It just matters if you're lucky enough to get justices that want to support your side more than the other. So anyways, first question I got for you. I'd like to know why the Michigan court sided differently than this court. Second is, why just the ballot? If you're telling me that this guy's not allowed to run because he was involved in an insurrection and that it's a violation of our Constitution to engage in insurrections and then hold office, then he should just be barred from holding office. I would think, like ballots, can I write people in? Can I still vote for a guy even if he's not on the ballot? I think it works that way. Can enough people show up and write in Donald Trump and then he can win anyways? So I don't understand why this would just be a ballot access issue. I would think they would need to be making a determination that he's not allowed to run at all. I would think that would be the determination that would have to be made. All right, now I'm going to throw this out there that it would look to me like the Supreme Court is probably going to get rid of this. I can't say that for fact. We'll see what happens when it gets there. But they also got the Jack Smith one coming through, which is Jack Smith wants to know if presidential immunity makes his entire case a moot point. And, the Supreme Court's sitting around and on both of these, like, fuck, we have to actually weigh in on these because they're lazy. They like to kick everything back to whoever they can and go, hey, this isn't our obligation. This is for you to figure out. Or what we saw with the coronavirus, they could go, yeah, government shouldn't be doing this at all. But if they are going to do it, they at least need to apply these laws equally between churches and malls. And, they're lazy people over there. They try not to exert their authority. They try and stay out of these things. I wonder if they're just going to maybe Clarence Thomas or someone else can just get up and can you guys just knock it off? Just be like, can you guys just stop with all this Trump shenanigans? Maybe that would be better if they just decided the first one where they go, yeah, the guy was president. He can't be prosecuted. Go beat him in an election. This is supposed to be up to the voters. And you guys are wasting a lot of taxpayer resources to, make this not fair fight. That'd be great. If they called it the just knock it off ruling of 2024. The first, maybe they made that the government's New Year's resolution was to quit being annoying on everything Trump and just making this a whole circular thing of nonsense. Like I've said, Trump is a racist old lady. And what happens is, if everyone's outside beating up on the racist old lady, you don't hear the racist old lady being a racist. And so you take the old lady's side where you're like, why is everyone being mean to this old lady? But then if you leave the old lady alone, you stop beating her with canes and throwing her purse all over the place. She starts collecting her things and you go, you see, that's why we can't have the blacks in this country. Everyone's like, oh my God, that's a racist old lady. And that's the problem. All these things, you're just waking people up to how evil our government is and how annoying the whole Trump thing was. Like, you're going to reverse all the stuff you did the last time around when you threw a temper tantrum and people are like, you know what? Can we just get rid of Trump so I don't need to hear the temper tantrum anymore? I think enough of this shenanigans. People are going to start waking up of quit throwing a temper tantrum. This is annoying.
And Johnson makes a very important point. As a former military person and CIA analyst, the U.S. Navy is unprepared for a prolonged war with Yemen. Unprepared. We've got a couple carrier groups in there. We've got innumerable. You have an Aegis a cruiser here shooting off a missile. You have tons of these in the area. Nevertheless, you have an enormous amount of danger. You have shipping stopped. The major insurance companies are refusing to provide insurance to Israeli ships or ships that will go to Israeli ports. And insurance for the rest of the ships is very high too. Go to the next clip. This is what Larry Johnson is pointing out in his very important article. He says, tiny Yemen has surprised the West with its tenacity and ferocity in attacking ships trying to ferry containers and fossil fuel to Israel. Yes, it's a violation of international law, and the West is fully justified in trying to thwart Yemen. On paper, it would appear that Yemen is outnumbered and seriously outgunned. A sure loser, not so fast. He says the U.S. Navy, which constitutes the majority of the fleet sailing against Yemen, has some real vulnerabilities that will limit its actions. And he goes on to point out a few of them, which is that the U.S. Navy of today is not the U.S. Navy of before. They've jettisoned a lot of the of their original. He talks about, and I won't want to go too far into the woods here, but they've decommissioned some of the submarine tenders, all of the repair ships and destroyer tenders, moved away from sailor-manned shore intermediate maintenance centers. Not only did this eliminate the ability to conduct intermediate maintenance over there, but it destroyed the progression of apprentice to journeyman to master technician that made the U.S. Navy sailor one of the premier maintenance resources in the military world. To shorten essentially what he's saying is these ships are high maintenance and they don't have any maintenance people on them. They rely on going back to port, not only for maintaining the ships, but also for the missiles. They cannot reload at sea, and it's a big deal. It's a big problem for them because each of these cruisers, these Aegis cruisers, carries 9 missiles, and these 9 missiles are used to shoot down incoming drones, incoming missiles from Yemen. And as Johnson pointed out in his piece, okay, you've got 90 of these. After that, you got to go back, you got to find a port somewhere and reload. Well, what if the Houthis shoot 91? You're able to shoot down 90, that's great. But what about that 91st? What about if they do a drone swarm, hundreds and hundreds come in? You're going to have a potentially extremely serious situation in the Red Sea area. Going to be a very difficult time, and you have, I don't know how many numbers of U.S. ships, U.S. military ships there. You sink 1 or 2 of them, what's that going to do to the perception of U.S. military invincibility? So it's a real powder keg, it's a real danger. I'm sure there's nothing that Biden and his neocons would like to do more than just take out Yemen, take them down, take out the Houthis. Not that easy. The Saudis already tried it. So we'll keep a very close eye on this, guys. This is important. Your gas is going to go up. You're going to notice it at the pump, and it could get a lot worse.
And he is on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So this is his committee. And now let's listen to, what do we want? We want 1 minute and 7 seconds of what Representative McCormick has to say. I just got back from a conference at the Reagan Library, where we had several secretaries of defense, we had secretaries of state, we had an amazing array of both Democrats and Republicans, but every Republican, and I'm talking to Republicans right now, I think this is a really important conversation to have. Every single former Secretary of Defense I've talked to, all the way back to Reagan, is very much in support of Ukraine. The strategic outcome of Ukraine will not only impact all of Europe, but also the Far East. China's paying attention to what's happening there. They're looking at what they want to do in Taiwan, which would be catastrophic to our chip industry, by the way, because they produce 100% of our AI chips. It's a strategic corridor where I think 70% of the world's wealth goes through every single day. It is a strategic essence to keep Ukraine. First of all, we made a promise, both in the Budapest Accords and NATO's unanimous vote to support a country that was invaded by a communist country. We're going to talk about that here.
So there are a couple of things in this. Representative McCormick on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, says that we must defend Ukraine because it was invaded by a communist country. Well, as we know, the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, and certainly Russia, which it was part of the USSR, has not been communist for those 30-some years. So incredibly ill-informed. You can make a slip. It didn't sound like a slip. He also misrepresented the Budapest Memorandum. But the other thing I want to draw your attention to on this, if you watch the clip, he went to an event at the Reagan Library where he got a song and dance, and he repeated, every single Republican I talked to. Well, what were they like? Were they neocons? More than likely. But the other thing in closing that I would point to, look how often he looks down at his desk as he tries to throw out these quotes. He was given a list. He was given talking points, maybe by these wonderful secretaries of defense at the Reagan Library. Nevertheless, he's repeating lines that it looks very clear to me that he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand what he's saying. He doesn't understand the rationale. My guess is if you could have him sitting here on the show and we could have asked him 5 questions about what he said, he would have been incapable of answering any of them. And I don't even mean gotcha questions, I mean basic questions. So here's a problem. You have Congress that's full, with some exceptions, of know-nothings who nevertheless have enormous power and are fed talking points by the military-industrial complex, by the think tanks, by the neocons who are infected every corner of DC and beyond. And it's a real problem because it affects the rest of us. It affects our economy. It affects our existential future. If we continue to irritate nuclear-armed countries and pretend that we're going to go to war with them, it's a big problem for the United States. So next time you hear a congressman, don't forget, they don't know anything more than what they're being fed, with very few exceptions. And there are some exceptions to that. So,
now, I stress that it is important to choose the correct genus and differential. I could say a cigarette is a pig with wings. I've given a genus and a differential of sorts, but that is hardly a valid definition, so a whole series of further rules is required. Aristotle goes into complex, specific, very valuable detail on this question. I will mention simply 2 of his many rules to give you an idea of the nature of his view and achievement. To begin with, he says your definition must be commensurate, C-O-M-M-E-N-S-U-R-A-T-E, commensurate with the class you are defining. In other words, it must be true only of members of the class and of all of those members. So you can go wrong in 2 ways on this rule. Either your genus might be too wide, or it might be, your definition rather, might be too wide or too narrow. Take in too much territory or not enough. So for instance, suppose I were to say, man is a member of reality. Well, as a definition, that obviously takes in everything and therefore doesn't define man. Now, it is not much better to say man is a social animal. By this same count, what about ants? Or to say man is a featherless biped, you know, a two-legged thing which has no feathers, which is how some Platonists once defined man. And according to the legend, what a group of Aristotelians passed by and threw a plucked chicken into their midst. To indicate that this definition is too wide, it takes in too much territory. It can't be the essence which makes man man. And on the other side, the too narrow type is all around us today too. If I say man is an American living in the 20th century, that's obviously too narrow. Or man is an Aryan, the Nazi working definition of man. Or man is the entity who feels compassionate, benevolent, self-sacrificial love for the suffering, which is the newspaper editorialist definition of man. That is all too narrow. Does not take in all members of the species. Definitions must be commensurate. But that's not enough. Go on to one more rule. It is not enough for the definition to be commensurate. In addition, the definition must state the fundamental characteristics of the class to be defined. Now, there are such things as commensurate but derivative characteristics. That is, characteristics true of all and only of members of a certain class, but which are not basic, which are results of something deeper, which is basic. For instance, suppose I say man is the being, assuming he's not damaged, with the capacity to talk, or the being with a sense of humor. Now, those qualities he has because he has reason, and therefore they cannot validly be definitional of man. They are effects of his essence. They are not his essence. Or if I say a triangle is the plane figure whose angle sum equals 180 degrees, it's true. It's true only of triangles, but it is not the definition of triangle because it can be explained, the 180-degree angle, some by reference to the structure of a triangle combined with the axioms of geometry. Or if I say capitalism is a system which is highly productive, prosperous, and brings about the greatest happiness, the greatest number. This, as you know from objectivism, is true of capitalism and only of capitalism, but that is not what is the essence of capitalism, simply its consequence. That last example, needless to say, is not Aristotle's. Consequently, says Aristotle, we must make a firm distinction between the essence, the fundamental commensurate characteristics, versus the derivative characteristics. Now, these derivative characteristics Aristotle calls by the technical term properties. Properties. That's his technical use of the term. And he means by property those commensurate characteristics which are not fundamental, which are simply results or effects of the essence of the class. And using his essence property terms, what we do when we want to understand a fact is learn the connection between the essence of things and their properties. That's simply a reformulation of the point I made a few minutes ago, that the nature of a thing determines its characteristics and behavior. Therefore, in our definition, says Aristotle, we must keep a firm line between causes and effects, between essences and properties. If we don't, if we start including properties in our definitions and thus lose the distinction between essence and property, we will never be able to explain the properties, and we will simply get hopelessly confused.
So one thing was the Houthis' reaction to the U.S. launching this military operation, this new international coalition in the Red Sea. The Houthis said that they won't back down in defense of Gaza. So Yemen's Houthis responded to the U.S. launching a new military operation in the Red Sea by vowing that attacks on commercial shipping in the region will continue even if the U.S. mobilizes the entire world. The U.S. launched a 10-nation naval task force dubbed Operation Prosperity Garden after major shipping companies began pausing Red Sea transits due to the Houthi attacks. So it's 10 nations, including the U.S. Bahrain is the only regional country, and they're not on the Red Sea, but they're the only Arab country that has joined in on this coalition. So Mohammed al-Bukaiti, he is a senior member of the Houthis political bureau. He said, quote, even if America succeeds in mobilizing the entire world, our military operations will not stop, no matter the sacrifices it costs us. America's announcement of the establishment of the Coalition of Shame will not prevent us from continuing our military operations until the crimes of genocide in Gaza are stopped and food, medicine, and fuel are allowed to enter its besieged population, end quote. So that's what they've been saying all along, is that the only way to get them to stop is for a ceasefire in Gaza. So the Houthis are vowing to target all commercial shipping going to and from Israeli ports. They've also fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory. In some cases, U.S. warships have intervened and intercepted Houthi attacks. And so definitely an area to really keep an eye on here. It does seem like things can really potentially explode. So this article is from Consortium News, from Joe Loria. And it says, imprisoned publisher Julian Assange will face 2 high court judges over 2 days on February 20th to the 21st in 2024. And this is going to happen in London in what will likely be his last appeal against being extradited to the United States to face charges of violating the Espionage Act. Assange's wife, Stella Assange, confirmed that the hearing will take place at the Royal Courts of Justice. Assange had an earlier request to appeal rejected by High Court Judge Jonathan Swift on June 6th. Assange then filed an application to appeal that decision, and the dates have now been set. Assange is seeking to challenge both the Home Secretary's decision to extradite him, as well as to cross-appeal the decision by the lower court judge, Vanessa Barrister. Barrister had ruled in January 2021 to release Assange from Belmarsh prison and deny the U.S. request for extradition based on Assange's mental health, the chances of him to commit suicide, and the conditions of U.S. prison. So the original ruling was that he should not be extradited, that he should be released. But then the U.S. appealed her decision, issuing diplomatic assurances that Assange would not be mistreated in prison. The High Court, after a 2-day hearing in March 2022, accepted those assurances and rejected Assange's appeal. So this does seem to be his last chance to avoid extradition to the U.S. for the crime of exposing U.S. war crimes. That's why they want to lock him up. Gaza death toll at 20,000, likely to be even higher. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. He did some extra writing today. After 10 weeks of Israeli military operations in Gaza, authorities have counted 20,000 dead Palestinians. An overwhelming number of the dead are innocent civilians with no ties to Hamas. An aid group warns the actual death toll is likely higher as thousands of missing Gazans lay dead or dying under the rubble. Israeli officials say civilian deaths are part of eliminating Hamas. So there's a press release from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs basically saying that the death toll is likely much higher because of all the people under the rubble. And according to Gaza's government media office, the dead includes 8,000 children and 6,200 women, and at least 50,000 people have been wounded in these strikes. And that's another big number. And considering how the health systems have collapsed, a lot of those people aren't getting proper treatment. There's a lot of people that are maimed, a lot of children that are going to be crippled for life because of this. Just really horrific stuff. So an Israeli official told reporters on Wednesday that the mass destruction of civilian targets in Gaza is part of Israel's strategy of defeating Hamas. Reuters reported a legal advisor to the Israeli Defense Forces said that the Israeli military was carrying out thousands and thousands of attacks, and often attacks that require heavy firepower to destroy tunnels under Gaza used by Hamas. And Kyle mentions that report from 972 magazine that basically said the civilian, they're purposely targeting civilians. It's part of their strategy. And that's how, so over 20,000 in just over 2 months of this, and no sign of things slowing down. This article is from Responsible Statecraft, and it says the EU Council Summit of December 14th to the 15th offered a significant, if perhaps mainly symbolic, gesture toward Ukraine in agreeing to the formal opening of accession negotiations. So that's about Ukraine's membership in the EU. But at the same meeting, the bloc failed to approve financial support for Ukraine for the 4-year period through 2027, amounting to 50 billion euros. Approval of this aid was vetoed by Hungary. So the EU has been working to get this 50 billion euro aid package to Ukraine for a while now. It seems like it's just been going on for a long time. And this is 50 billion euros over a 4-year period that Ukraine would receive, and they still haven't been able to get it through. And it's Hungary is the big one that's been blocking it. But I know now, I believe Slovakia is against not just the military aid, but also financial aid to Ukraine. So that could also be a problem, because with the U.S. Aid drying up, the EU was thought to maybe be able to fill some gaps, but they're still just not able to pass this.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
What if the acceptance of the government as God has ruined individual initiative, destroyed personal work ethic, fostered cancerous laziness, and enhanced deep poverty, and most of all you have here, and impelled thoughtlessness, obedience to the government in those who have accepted it?
So, the government is like the devil popping out from behind a tree. Hey, give me your freedom, and I'll keep you safe. Now, of course, we all know that is a bargain that never works out. You give up your freedom, and you also give up your safety. But the government, of course, goes even farther. Murray Rothbard used to have a great one-liner. You're sitting at home one night, relaxing, and there's a knock on the door. You open the door, and there's a guy with a gun. And you go, I'm going to call the police. And the guy goes, no, don't bother. We are the police. We're here to take your money so that we can give it away in your name. So that's what the government does. It takes from the haves and gives to the have-nots. And then the have-nots are so devoted to the government, it's as if the government is their God, because they rely on the government for their subsistence every month. And the politicians, of course, want to increase the size of the have-nots so as to increase their voting base, so as to assure that the politicians will stay in office.
And what you said about, giving it to the have-nots, yes, but they also give to the haves. And
yes, of course they do. Of course they do.
They give the haves, the biggest of the haves, the most.
Correct. The government bribes the states with cash, the rich with bailouts, the middle class with tax cuts, and the poor with wealth transfers. The government exists on bribery. And the bigger you are, billionaire, state of New York, state of California, the bigger your bribe is.
That's right. Look at this crap. Hey, I'm gonna build a building. Hey, I'm gonna create jobs. I want a tax cut. I'm gonna build this. I want a tax cut. I want you to give me money to do this. Oh yeah, sure. Oh, and by the way, here's a payback. Morons and imbeciles call it campaign contributions. Adults call it bribes and payoffs. You go on here, you say, what if freedom is our birthright, given to us by a true God, not by the government as God?
Well, the government acts as if freedom were a water faucet, and it can turn it on when it wants and turn it off when it wants. Even though everybody in the government has taken an oath to the Constitution, and even though the 9th Amendment to the Constitution specifically provides for rights coming from our humanity too numerous to list in the document. Every president believes that he can curtail rights by some sort of executive order. None of them take seriously the Constitution.
You know, this is something, by the way, it's all over the world. You got these little clowns that become president, prime ministers, chancellors, and this is what I've decided, and this is what I'm going to do, and you do what I tell you to do. And again, it keeps going down. Look at the COVID war. Lock down your business. Stand 6 feet apart. Put on a mask. Do this, do that, do this, do that, do that, do this, do this. And yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Again, you have over here, what if we can never pursue happiness fully or know God completely without personal freedom?
We can't. We can never be happy. This is another thing that you've been out front on. Happiness is now a bad word in the government's articulation of it, even though the purpose of the Declaration of Independence is to secure, Jefferson now, the right to pursue happiness. But we can't pursue happiness without freedom. If the day the government tells you how to be happy is the day we're slaves.
You know, you just said what you just said. You can't pursue happiness without freedom.
Correct. And the
Nothing.
day the government tells you how to pursue happiness is the day we are slaves.
And that's what we're slaves.
Yes.
We've become, this is, you know, one of my lines is that we the people are plantation workers of Slavelandia.
Yes.
And that's what it's become. And one of our top trends for 2024 is going to be World War III. It's going to become official. There's either going to be a major false flag event, or with Ukraine going down, they're not coming back. It's only going to get worse. And they're going to do a baby bomb, a Russian nuclear plant, you know, something that's going to get them back to get support, a major false flag event. And Israel is going to ramp up this war, and they're going to bring Iran into it.
Yes.
And when that happens, it's going to be the official World War III. It's like, okay, all right, boys and girls, World War I began when they assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. You know, no. It didn't begin then. It began before that. Oh, no, World War II began when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that they knew about.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Yeah, isn't it? Everything's criminalized. I think you quoted Neil Gorsuch early in your book saying something to
I was so happy to find that quote from the Supreme Court justice, because some people think I'm radical, but no. So I have a quote from him. I even had a quote from favorite liberal justice, Peter Ginsburg, and folks like that. But now it's fascinating that people are recognizing that the government has criminalized everything. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that's a good idea nowadays.
Right. That is rather the problem. But yeah, of course, well, Mr. Moderate Jim Bovard quoting Supreme Court justices. What is your problem with old Jim? All right. I'm more or less keeping this thing in order, although if there's disorder, it's not within the frame. We'll put it that way. Right. But again, talking about last rights here, this is, as with other books of yours that I've read, it covers so much in so many different areas that I want to cover just a little bit of a whole bunch of things. So, of course, there's a section in here on housing, because government has screwed that up, and I've written about that myself. But there's a particular...
there's a book you did on that was the best New York Times bestseller, right?
Thank you, Jim. Meltdown, which would be somewhere on the shelf behind there. That's right. Well, you have a section, though, about something called Section 8. And we all hear Section 8 over and over and over. But I don't think anybody knows exactly what's in Section 8, because no one's read it. So what does that actually mean, and what are some of the problems associated with it?
Section 8 is a federal rental subsidy program created in the late 1974. It expanded pretty quickly, and it's become a synonym for urban problems or shifting the urban problems to the suburbs. There have been some studies that show a high correlation between Section 8 and a higher homicide rate. There are areas where what the government does is give out vouchers, and people can take these vouchers and then rent an apartment or house wherever they please, just as long as the price isn't too high. But the level for these Section 8 vouchers is a lot higher than what most Americans pay for rent. And you've had a lot of trouble in areas where they were linked to crime. The Housing and Urban Development Agency did a big study to see the impact of the Section 8 on the recipients. Didn't look at the effect on the neighbors, but one of the things that came out was there was a huge increase in crime by young people and the families of that. There was a study in Chicago that showed thousands of violent crimes at Section 8 addresses. The government tended to be very secretive as far as some of the real problems of the program, but it's come out, and there was even a rap band in D.C. for a while. They called itself Section 8 Law. It's kind of like, you wonder how the program gets a rap.
I just realized, by the way, if I can back up a bit, I forgot to ask you something I wanted to ask about TSA. If somebody said, all right, Mr. Smart Guy Libertarian, I understand that the TSA has its problems, but, look, there are bad actors in the world, and I don't want them flying on planes. So if you're so smart, what do you recommend?
Privatizing airport security, like they do in Canada, like they do in most Western European nations. There's no reason that the person who scans you needs to be a federal agent, because there's a huge issue that federal agents tend to have sovereign immunity. And so it doesn't matter if they grab you or, it's when I was doing some stories on TSA right around the time of Kavanaugh, his Supreme Court nomination, and there were the allegations of him sexually abusing a young woman, a young girl. And so what I did is did some searches on Twitter on TSA, just searching TSA and the names of various female anatomy. And there was this tidal wave of complaints from women who felt like they had been molested by TSA at checkpoints. But there was no legal recourse because the Justice Department and TSA were claiming that the TSA agents had immunity. That is starting to crumble. There have been 2 federal appeals courts that have basically turned that down. And now the TSA is actually going to have to justify its groping. And that could go badly.
It is such an interesting microcosm of so much of what the state does that on the surface of it, if you don't look beneath the state's own rationale for it, then you'd be satisfied that this is simply, public-minded people just trying to do what's best for everybody. I mean, that it's over and over again, whatever it is they're doing. Well, I mean, even the Fed managing the money supply, that's also in the interest of you and me, Jim. And you get just one little layer beneath it. And you see, and then once you see that, as you can never unsee it.
I hope you're right. I mean, the Federal Reserve is a great example. I mean, back when people were voting in the 2020 presidential election, when they were mailing in their ballots, I don't recall people asking for an 18% fall in the value of the dollar since Biden got elected, since Biden took office. But that's what's happened. And the media's tried to sweep it under the rug. This is having a huge impact on tens of millions of Americans, and especially to us independent contractors.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Think about all the online commerce. Everything that you buy on Amazon, on Walmart, all that stuff is shipped. And FedEx had a pretty big miss. They missed on the top line. They missed on the bottom line. And in fact, year over year, there was a decline, an actual decline in their revenues. Now, I'm sure that over the last year, FedEx has raised its prices. I mean, everybody's raised their prices. But despite that, they're actually doing less in nominal sales than they did before. And so this should, throw cold water on this parade that the economy is in great shape. Because the fact that a lot less stuff is getting shipped is an indication that maybe the consumer is running out of gas. I was listening to a clip, just came up. For some reason, this thing came up for me on YouTube, but it was a Dave Ramsey clip. But this woman had called, or a guy had called up and, talking about all the problems that they were having financially, even though they had a joint income of about $360,000 a year, they were still living paycheck to paycheck. And the wife had about $250,000 of student debt. But he pointed out that during this recent moratorium on student loans, when they didn't have to pay their student loans, they used that money to, build like a barn or something on their property. They spent like $100,000 building a barn or something, but they only did that because they used the money that they otherwise would have spent on repaying their student loans. And I'm sure this has been a typical situation where all the Americans that didn't have to pay their student loans, they just used that money. They've been spending that money on other things. Well, to the extent that they're now making payments on these student loans, well, they have to stop spending money on other things. And so maybe that's why FedEx is not shipping as much stuff, is because the people are now paying their student loans back instead of buying stuff on Amazon that needs to be shipped. Ever since Powell let the cat out of the bag and basically conceded that rates are coming down, and they're coming down substantially, the markets, got ahead of it. And in fact, I think the mood on Wall Street was, happy days are here again. We're going back to zero. We're going back to QE, because that is the experience of the past. I mean, once the Fed starts cutting, they don't stop until they get to zero. I mean, that's what they've done in the past, right? And so why would anybody assume that the future is going to be any different? And in fact, considering how quickly Powell capitulated on rate cuts, because as I pointed out in an earlier podcast, in the November meeting, Powell said, we're not even thinking about rate cuts. And then in the December meeting, not only are they thinking about it, but they're plotting it on these dot plots. And that's all he talked about is cutting rates. So in one meeting, it was a complete pivot on rate cuts. Why shouldn't the markets expect that a similar pivot is coming with respect to quantitative easing? I mean, that's, the big enchilada that's coming is a return to QE. And why wouldn't they do that? They returned to QE before. Remember, when the Fed's balance sheet was like $4 trillion, they started shrinking it. They never even made it down to $3 trillion, and then they blew it up to $9 trillion. And so, so now they started to shrink it. All right, it's below $8 trillion. But if they couldn't shrink the smaller balance sheet, it's even less likely that they can shrink this even larger balance sheet, especially in an election year. The odds would seem to favor that going into an election year, especially, when Biden is as unpopular as he is, right? So he's going to need a lot of help to get reelected. And the Fed typically can be counted on to supply that help. And so the markets are getting in front of this. Obviously, it's an election year. They want to put a lipstick on the pig of an economy, that is Bidenomics. What can the Fed do? Well, let's start cutting rates. Let's go back to quantitative easing. Let's goose the markets. Let's get people excited and let them believe that the economy is getting better. And maybe they think, who cares about these inflation numbers because we just got to make it through the election. Maybe the result of us returning to quantitative easing and cutting rates, maybe the impact that has on prices won't manifest itself until after the November elections, and then it's too late, right? You can't take your vote back, right? If you actually get fooled into believing we have a good economy and you vote, 4 more years for Biden, and then after the election, you find out the truth, right? All of a sudden, prices take off and it hits the fan, you can't get your vote back. I mean, it's a final buy, right? There's no returns, right? You vote and you're stuck with who you voted for. So all they have to do is delay the consequences until after this election. So the markets know this, they think this, and so they're buying. But then, you've got all these Fed guys coming out and saying, maybe we're not going to cut. We're not so sure, right? We got to wait and see. We actually need more data. We're not really talking about rate cuts. And since that's the only thing that the market's got going for it, it's all about liquidity. It's all about inflation. That's the story. It's an expensive market, and the economy is weak. But that's the hope that the markets have been bid up on. And so I think finally we've started to see some surrender. So.
Well, but Jim, what about the federal court cases where they ruled that Snowden was right and that the stuff that he exposed was illegal, and then they struck it down and they forced Congress to pass these laws to fix it all, like in the deal?
Scott, it's important for you to cut back on the weed. Yeah, I mean, there were some judges that had some very eloquent decisions spurred by Snowden's revelation. Snowden is a hero, as I said in USA Today 5 years ago. Snowden should get the Presidential Medal of Freedom for what he did. But basically, Congress didn't do much at all, and they were kind of said, yeah, well, this is not so good. Now, it's funny, if you turn back the clock to the last time that FISA was reauthorized, early 2018, there was about 67 or maybe 84 minutes in which it was unclear if Congress would actually do that, because President Trump saw an episode or some comments on Fox News that said, oh, this is a terrible law. So Trump did a tweet or two saying, oh, this FISA stuff is terrible. We don't need this. But, there was a full court press on him, and Trump flipped within less than 2 hours. And so, of course, it got renewed.
Let me ask you about this article, more nails in the coffin of Biden's censorship regime. Dare I read that headline as somebody wrote it?
Hey, I didn't say it was my headline. So, yeah, I was. Well, see, this is the holiday season. So I'm trying to have much more upbeat headlines for the stories about how the government's blowing your rights to pieces.
Yeah, man. There you go. Well, I appreciate the half full take here. And you do have a great picture of Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger here featured testifying before Congress. And we got these lawsuits, and we got these great Twitter file journalists working on this. And we're learning more all the time. And the courts are angry about it, and the Congress is fighting about it. So tell us what's up.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of good pressure. It's one of the really good things about the GOP take over the House of Representatives. They've done some excellent hearings on the weaponization of government power. They haven't gotten the credit for it from the mainstream media because
most of the media coverage has been in the tank for the feds. But they've been pushing it out. They're putting out layer after layer of detail of how the craven details of how the feds and federal contractors suppressed censored American speech. It's great that there was a federal district court that said that, the federal appeals court said that, and now it's before the Supreme Court. And one of the things which is interesting here is how the feds are seeking to define consent, because part of the defense for the saying that the FBI didn't censor is that, well, the FBI made a request and people consented. Yeah, you get the FBI, saying, this is a problem, take action on this. At the same time, you've got President Biden, who came out and accused social media companies of murder for not suppressing any information that might make people hesitate to get their COVID vaccines, which Biden also pulled strings to force the FDA to give full approval to, even though the evidence warned of a lot of problems with those vaccines.
Well, look, I mean, as always, it's not just an argument from authority. If what they're saying is really sharp and good and quotable and useful, that, hey, even the Supreme Court justice is saying that this is not right, even if he doesn't win every time. It's a powerful dissent for showing people what's right and just how far they've gone. God help us if people really start to feel, after it's already been a decade of this and after another decade, that, like, of course, this is just how it is. Government has to curate the news for us. Otherwise, we'd get it wrong. And if people really believe that that's just how it always is, well, geez, Scott, who's going to build the roads? Somebody's got to censor the channels, Yeah,
I mean, things are bad already. There was one recent poll that showed that 55% of American adults said that government should, protect people from false information. And I guess that would mean canceling all the elections.
Yes,
it's like, this is bizarre. And this is a time when only 20% of the people trust the government. So what you have is that people cannot politically add 2 and 2. Government's untrustworthy, or they're going to save us from false information.
Right.
Where did I go wrong?
I know. You know what? I remember 25 years ago, my friend Rick told me, well, at least they know they're being lied to, right? You can see that they know something's not right, but they just don't know who else to turn to other than whatever, the guys who supposedly are our protectors. They must be honest, or why would we have given them that job?
Well, thank God they've got podcasts now they can turn to.
Yeah. Well, the New York Times says they're unfettered, like shackles.
Unfettered.
Yeah, we gotta.
Hey, that's a badge of honor.
Seriously, and it's a reason for us to really watch out. I mean, this is sort of the final frontier of free speech, and they just took a massive subsidy away from SpaceX and their internet project, $900 million, I think it was, and so obviously didn't deserve that money at all in the first place. But you can see the government agenda there for Elon Musk's businesses, which are so government dependent. That they're trying to punish him.
It's
Keep him in line.
Hard times coming.
Yep.
Don't tread on us.
What is free market capitalism?
It's actually nothing more abstract and strange than the economic aspect of individual freedom. When people are free to go about their business and choose how to act, how to behave, whom to associate with, and what to do with their lives, that's freedom. And when we do this in the economic sphere, mostly associated with what kind of occupation we choose, whether we want to start businesses or not, how to save our money, whom to trade with and do business with. That's economic freedom. That's capitalism.
There seems to be a huge dichotomy. Almost everyone I speak to will say, oh yeah, sure, religious freedom is fine. You can have whatever religion you want, even if it's to your own detriment, even if you waste your entire life believing something that's false, so long as you don't force others to either fund your religion or join it. You can always persuade people. However, they have almost the complete opposite position when it comes to economic freedom. Yet, when you were doing research for this book, do you see why this dichotomy exists in the minds of so many people?
Well, yeah, I noticed that in so many places as well. People, theoretically, they like freedom and they like it in different spheres, but somehow it gets complicated the moment we start to talk about exchange, whenever we talk about money or something like that. And the impression I get when I talk to people is that they think about religious freedom and other kinds of personal liberties like that as something it's all about yourself. It's how you choose to live your own life. It doesn't really affect others, though it does, but less so than acting in the economic sphere. And that's true. The actions we do on a market, they always involve somebody else because we do business, we trade, we exchange. Somebody else is involved. And to me, that's the best part of it, because in a free market, then no deal ever happens unless both parties think that they both benefit from it. Otherwise, they would walk away. So whenever you affect others, it is by offering something that they wouldn't have otherwise. It might be your time, it might be goods, services, technological capacities, or funding, or what have you. Whatever it is, it's an offer to improve somebody else's life or not. So that's, I think this is why it gets complicated. But to me, this is an extra argument for economic freedom.
I love the way you describe that, because so often the free market is seen as every man for himself, dog eat dog competition. Like, this completely complex network of millions of people exchanging is described as every man for himself, Robinson Crusoe style, which is so bizarre, the fact that ever took hold. I want to look at the Communist Manifesto. Tell me what is wrong, if anything, with this. Capitalism's immoral because people have to work to live. Communism's moral because it gives people what they need to live, regardless of whether they are forced to work. How do you respond?
Well, the question is, if you don't have to work for your wealth, where does it come from? Capital doesn't just exist out there. It's something you create. Capital is capital goods. It's machinery. It's funds that you use to invest and build something new. It doesn't come from out of the blue. It's something that we all create. And if you say that someone is going to be able to live without working, that it's somehow degrading to do something for others in order to earn an income or capital, then it means that somebody else is going to have to work for you. So it really means a system of enforced labor. And that's really what the ideas of Marx and Engels led to when they said that we'll find another, less degrading way of creating wealth than having to find the places in the economy where we do the best good services to others and exchange with others voluntarily. Well, then they ended up with forcing people to move to certain areas of the economy to do certain services for the government instead.
When it comes to mass production of goods that increases the standard of living of the average person, we frequently hear that, well, when things are privatized, only the rich can afford them. What is it about capitalism that allows products and services over time to both increase in quality and increase in their accessibility to the average person? I'm thinking of cameras by people like George Eastman did not invent the camera, but he made it much more available. Henry Ford did not invent the car, but he made it much more accessible to people. Same thing with Vanderbilt and the steamships. Is this a feature of capitalism, or could the state take this over and do just as good a job in healthcare and housing?
Well, I think we can look at the empirical data. What is it that comes down in price? Well, everything that's traded on a market. And what is that that has over the long period of time, over a longer period of time? What is it that stays costly or increases in price? Well, everything that the government is involved with, basically. And this is because of the basic incentive of capitalism. The elite is small. That's why it's called the elite. And if you only produce for them, you won't make much money. The low and middle income households, there are many more of them. And if you can continue to turn what used to be luxury goods for the elites into routine manufacturing for the poor, then you will make tons of profits as well. It was Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, who said that, Queen Elizabeth in the 17th and late 16th century, she had silk stockings and she could afford cotton clothes. And that's not what's new with capitalism. The new thing with capitalism is that you come up with methods and better production and new ideas to make sure that even factory girls could have stockings as well, and many pairs of them as well, because that's how you make a fortune in the long run. But that's all dependent on this competition from lots of different entrants into the market who continue to come up with even weirder ideas on how to make things come down in price over time.
This is Dan Patrick. He's the lieutenant governor here in Texas, and he suggests maybe we should take Biden off the ballot in Texas. Maybe that's a good idea. And if you go to the next one, here's what Dan Patrick says. Seeing what happened in Colorado tonight makes me think, except we believe in democracy in Texas, but maybe we should take Joe Biden off the ballot for allowing 8 million people to cross the border since he's been president, disrupting our state far more than anything anyone else has done in recent history.
Yeah, and there are Democrats waking up to this, the ones who want to live in a reasonable society and not look like a jerk for supporting something that is so outlandish. So they're starting to come around, and with the right ruling, there's going to be a lot of people, this issue gets dropped and people will have less fun about it, but it's still very, very serious, and they're undermining the total principles. But the system isn't all that great anyway. The electoral system, the majority dictatorship of what we have, the founders didn't like it. And from the very first campaign I was ever in, I was introduced to how it really operates, because there was a shock that I was beating this Democrat and all kinds of things were done. So that's a long time ago. And we know about LBJ. LBJ could never have been president with us really stealing an election, which is fully documented. So it's there's a lot of shortcomings on democracy. And because they always use the election of an individual, but the founders didn't set it that way. They wanted a representative government. The election of the president was never well intended to say that, and people want to move further in the direction of saying it's a majority vote. It's just individual vote. So we want the cities that really need a lot of help. San Francisco and Chicago and Detroit, Washington D.C. They can elect the president and cancel out 98% of the other population. So that's what democracy can end up. And it also shows that if they're going to do it to one group, the other people came along. So I think that I think Patrick knows that's not going to happen. But I think it's a great way of making a point, because some of the Democrats now are saying, if we keep impeaching Trump, maybe they'll do that to our president. And what do we have? We have an impeachment process going on. Of course, this guy deserves it.
Yeah, they're certainly there. I mean, it does feel like a descent into idiocracy in a way, because, you bar our guy, well, we're going to bar your guys. And pretty soon, I mean, it's a joke. And I just have a couple more examples of Republicans suggesting we could do tit for tat. Let's go through a couple of these if we can. This is from The Blaze. This is Ron DeSantis. He reacts to the Colorado Supreme Court power grab quote. There was no trial. We got a thing popping up on that corner. There was no trial on any of this. Could we just say that Biden can't be on the ballot because he let in 8 million illegals? So here's DeSantis in Florida. And here we have the next one. If we go next, this is Kellyanne Conway on her show. She asked if Governor Kristi Noem, if she could bar Biden from the South Dakota ballot. Why can't she do it? And here is another interesting one, if we can. And I don't know who this person is. He could be a kook, but it makes an interesting point. Phil Kezak, he says, so under Colorado reasoning, a Florida court could hold a hearing, determine that Joe Biden took bribes, and bar him from being on the ballot for a federal election, despite the fact that Joe Biden was never formally charged and convicted of bribery. Interesting.
But if it did happen, I think that would tip things over. I think there would be a lot of violence, and in that sense, very, very dangerous. And a lot of the restraints, you can't believe it, but there's probably been restraints of people who get so disgusted with what's happening and how destructive it is to endorse a system that preaches and teaches, the redistribution of wealth as a holy thing. And of course, that's the entire system we've had for almost 100 years. And it's amazing we get by that way. And then they turn around and believe in lying is okay. That's not a big deal. And having counterfeit money, that's okay too. And they, on the vote count, it always bothers me when they say they want to overthrow the election or overthrow the government. Well, I don't know why they couldn't have referred to this as a recount. Why don't we count all the votes? Find out if they were legal votes. We just want an investigation. If you have nothing to hide, you should be all for this. To clean the air. Oh no, we'll put you guys in jail for suggesting it.
I mean, Trump gets himself in trouble by the way he says something, but it's not illegal to put your foot in your mouth constantly. That's unfortunately just his style. But if an insurrection is using deception to change the electoral results, then you could certainly make the argument, and I think you have, that the Russiagate was a kind of insurrection because it was a bunch of lies, it was deception, and the intent of that was to change the outcome of the election. So maybe the other side is just as guilty if that's all it takes.
Yeah, and they use January 6th as the insurrection that Trump did. But I think the policing activity, the FBI and the Justice Department, that is where you could probably make a pretty good case that there's been an insurrection and a destruction of our judicial system. That's much more dangerous to us than what they're claiming Trump did.
All right, let's go on. Suppose we know how to formulate correct definitions. We know how to state the essence of some class. We wanted to know that, we said, because the essence of a class determines its properties, determines its behavior. Things of the same essence will behave the same way. Same nature, same properties. There are, in a word, and I'm introducing a new topic now, but obviously related, there are general laws in reality governing how things behave. And these laws, according to Aristotle, always take one form. A thing of such and such a nature has such and such properties. A thing of such and such an essence behaves in such and such a way. If we could discover these general laws, we could then explain the initial observations that we made at the outset. We observe, for instance, that Socrates is mortal. But if we can grasp the nature of man, and then say, look, all things of this essence, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, we would thereby have explained the fact of his mortality. And therefore, Aristotle's theory of explanation, to put it in a mouthful, but this is the essence of it, is explanation consists of seeing the particular events we observe as instances of a general principle which relates the nature of some class to its mode of action. That's the essence of Aristotle's theory. To understand any particular fact or observation, we must subsume it under general principles. Do you want me to repeat that, I trust? Explanation consists in seeing the particular events we observe as instances of a general principle, the principle which relates the nature of a class to its mode of action. Now, you should see here that there is an obvious influence of Plato on Aristotle on this point, because this is derived in a certain way from Plato's divided line. You remember when you get to stage 3 of the divided line and reach the forms, the universals, they illuminate, according to Plato, and make intelligible the particulars? Well, this is actually the same point that Plato made there, that the general explains the particular, but now stated in a literal scientific fashion, stripped of metaphor and mysticism. But Plato here gets credit for the insight, even if buried in mystical framework. Now the question goes, how do we discover these general principles? All men are mortal. Or to vary the example, all hot stoves, assuming they're hot enough, burn you, assuming you keep your fingers close enough to them long enough, and so on. You don't observe general principles, not the principles. And yet they're indispensable to explain what we do observe. All we observe are particulars. There must then, says Aristotle, be a process of acquiring the knowledge of the general principle by observing the particular facts. And this process he calls induction, epagoge in Greek, induction. And that is defined as the process of passing in thought from particulars to a general principle. And it is, according to Aristotle, a fundamental procedure of human knowledge, because it is the ultimate source of all of our general principles. General principles are not reached by a recollection of another dimension, but by generalization from particulars that we actually observe. And therefore, all the principles by which we explain particulars must, says Aristotle, come ultimately from generalizing from the particulars that we observe. And therefore, there's an exact parallel between concept formation and the arriving at general laws. We go from percepts to concepts, or from individual facts to general laws. In both cases, not by recollection, anamnesis, or mysticism, but by being able to abstract. How can we do this? Quote, the soul is so constituted as to be capable of this process, unquote. Now, Aristotle wrote very little about induction. He was the first, if we leave aside certain hints from Socrates and Plato, he was the first officially to recognize that it was indispensable to human knowledge, but he had very little to say about it, and I should add for accuracy that like all the Greeks, he had a primitive concept of induction. He had what's called induction by simple enumeration, which is induction simply by enumerating instances. You see man 1 die, man 2, man 3, and after a while you say, well, I guess all men must be mortal. Aristotle had no knowledge, none of the Greeks did, nor did the medievals, of the experimental methods that are a modern discovery. He did not know about controlled experimentation, whereby on a few instances you could with assurance validate a general law. And consequently, he did not think that by induction alone you could prove the truth of a law. Because after all, he was aware you might have struck a coincidence. How do you know that the instances you observed are really representative of a general principle? Or perhaps there was a hidden necessary condition concealed from you, which won't always operate and which will therefore invalidate your generalization. And therefore, in Aristotle's opinion, lacking the more sophisticated modern concepts of induction, he thought the best you could get by induction was the suggestion of a law, which you then had to validate by some other means. In this sense, of course, his epistemology is deficient. And I mention this for the record. However, his basic view of the indispensability of induction is correct. But it does require supplementing with the theory of the rules of validating induction. Now, I do not wish to suggest that the modern experimental method is a full answer to that question. It is a partial lead. The full answer to that question awaits formulation. It has never yet in writing been presented. All right, let's assume now that we have arrived at general laws by induction and have validated. Now we can take our laws and apply them to new particular cases, predicting what will happen in advance because we know the laws, explaining what we observe because we know the laws. We can now go in the opposite direction. Starting from Socrates, Plato, Plotinus, and a number of other individual men, we induced to reach the conclusion all men are mortal. Now we can turn around when we encounter Joe Glutz and say, all men are mortal. Joe Glutz is a man, therefore even though he hasn't died, I know Joe Glutz will be mortal too. And that process of starting with the general principle and applying it to a particular case is, of course, deduction. And therefore, knowledge for Aristotle is the integrated employment of induction and deduction. Induction gives you the basic general laws. Deduction uses these laws to explain and understand particular instances. And, of course, you do not stop with your first inductions. You don't stop with all men are mortal or all hot stoves burn, any more than on the level of concept formation you stop with green, red, and bananas. You go on again to ask, why is this general law so? And, says Aristotle, again, by a process of broader induction, you find a more general law, from which you can deduce the law that you first arrived at by induction. So, for instance, we first arrived by induction at the conclusion that all men are mortal, just by observing instances. Now, by taking a wider field of vision, we observe that carrots, bumblebees, pigs, and pussycats are mortal. And we induce all living things are mortal. Now we say to ourselves, all living things are mortal, and man is a living thing, therefore man must be mortal. And we have now deduced, and thus explained, a law that we originally arrived at simply by induction. And of course, it continues on the process. The process of knowledge, therefore, is a systematic integrated employment of induction and deduction, going progressively deeper into the laws of reality, finding more and more basic ones by wider and wider inductions, each new induction permitting you to deduce the preceding level, and so on. More and more of reality being explained at each step, so your laws are organized into a systematic chain of deductions.
Here's Jerry Seinfeld out in Gaza doing stand-up for the, what's the deal with all these tunnels? Usually tunnels because you want to go somewhere. These guys are just tunneling to another spot in Gaza. Where do they go? Hey, does your side suck too? Well, I'm on the other side of the tunnel. Kind of sucks over here. And who would take a baby as a hostage? No one likes dealing with a baby. Can you imagine terrorists 2 in the morning? Who's feeding this baby? I can't do this. I have people I have to terrorize in the morning. Someone else is going to have to care for this baby. You know, they take you hostage, but then they have to care for you. It's not easy caring for someone you don't care for. They took you because they don't like you, but now they have to be nice to you. I'm getting more mixed signals from this terrorist guy. Like your divorced wife sending you hot nudes from your house. I'm totally listening. Are we trying to hang her or what? You know, I'd like to see that tunnel.
So 1 in 4 Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, over 570,000 people, are starving due to the Israeli siege. And this is based on a report using data from the UN and other aid agencies that was released on Thursday. So this report, published by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, said the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has caused catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity across the Gaza Strip. The IPC, they have a 5-phase scale for malnutrition, and the report estimates that the entire population of Gaza is facing phase 3 or higher. So phase 3 is already bad enough as it is. It is defined as households either having food consumption gaps that are reflected by high or above usual acute malnutrition, or are marginally able to meet minimum food needs, but only by depleting essential livelihood assets or through crisis coping strategies. So basically saying food is hard to come by and there is some malnutrition as it is. And that's what they're saying the entire population of Gaza is facing. And it says 1 in 4 households in Gaza are at phase 5. And that means catastrophic famine-like conditions. Phase 5 is defined as, and I'll read the quote from, this is how they define this. Quote, households have an extreme lack of food and or other basic needs, even after full employment of coping strategies. Starvation, death, destitution, and extremely critical acute malnutrition levels are evident. For famine classification, the area needs to have extreme critical levels of acute malnutrition and mortality, end quote. So they're saying a quarter of the population is facing famine, is basically what they're saying. So the UN Security Council again pushed back a vote on a Gaza resolution that was initially scheduled to be brought forward for a vote on Monday. The vote is now scheduled for Friday and was delayed throughout the week due to the threat of a U.S. veto. the U.S. worked to water down the resolution and remove a call for the cessation of hostilities. According to AFP, after negotiators worked on Thursday, the latest draft version of the resolution calls for creating the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. So it calls for the creating of the conditions. It doesn't call for a ceasefire, doesn't call for a cessation of hostilities. So the U.S. got that taken out of it. And another major sticking point about the resolution, which was put forward by the UAE, was a call to give the UN exclusive control of inspections of humanitarian aid before it enters Gaza. And that's something that the U.S. and Israel rejected. According to the Washington Post, the UN also wanted more flexible language on that issue, and that this new draft that was circulated on Thursday satisfied at least some of the U.S. concerns with that issue. Enough so that the U.S. plans to abstain from voting for the resolution. They're not going to vote for it, but they're not going to veto it. The Senate adjourned for the holidays on Wednesday without reaching a deal on Ukraine aid and will not return to Washington until January 8th. The Senate was initially due to break for holiday recess at the end of last week, but Majority Leader Chuck Schumer had senators return on Monday to try and reach a border deal to unlock the massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Republicans want significant changes to asylum and immigration laws to restrict the flow of migrants entering the country before approving the foreign military aid package, which includes over $60 billion to fund the Ukraine war for another year. The White House has indicated that it's willing to support new immigration restrictions, but it's unclear when an agreement will be made. According to The Hill, a group of Senate and White House negotiators have agreed to hold a virtual meeting over Christmas and New Year's break, but no votes will happen until next year. House Speaker Mike Johnson adjourned his chamber last week. Johnson and other Republican leadership have made clear that they will support the foreign military aid package once the Democrats make enough concessions on border policy, but we just don't know when this deal is going to happen.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
The national median existing home price rose 4% in November from a year earlier to $387,600, according to the National Association of Realtors. 387. There's no inflation. Fuck off. Inflation's taken care of. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Everything's fine. Who can afford that? You got a job at Target? No, I work at Starbucks. I'm a barrister. How about a coffee jerk? When I was a kid, I worked in a soda fountain. They call us soda jerks. No, I was a soda barrister. They give you those names because they treat you like shit and pay you crap. So they build you up with a name. You're a barrister, a barista, or whatever the fuck they call it. Yep. What else? You ready? Small U.S. banks are increasingly at risk in commercial property slump. Holy shit, blow me away. Wow, big story on Bloomberg yesterday. We warned about this over 3 years. It's your bank, your office building bust. This thing is going to be very serious. And you better get ready for your top trends of 2024. They're going to be out in 2 weeks. And one of them is going to be relating to this. About 14% of all commercial real estate loans and 44% of loans on office buildings appear to be in negative equity. Why? You're selling fear and hysteria. Everything is just fine. You only have an office occupancy rate of 50%, according to Castle Systems. Depending on whose numbers you're looking at office vacancy rates anywhere between vacant, nobody in there, boop, zero, nada. In the United States, between 14 and 20%. U.S. banks held about $2.7 trillion in commercial real estate debt at the end of the third quarter, according to the University of California. Commercial property values down 22%. Everything's fine. Keep playing those markets. Step right up, step right up. You ready? Container rates hit $10,000 as ocean freight inflation soars in Red Sea crisis. Yeah, the Houthis are bombing ships going out because the Houthis have been slaughtered. Everybody forgets this shit. By that arrogant Nobel Peace of Crap Prize winner, Barack Obama. Yep. And he sent over to Anthony Blinken. I'm Anthony Blinken. I went to Dalton. I went to Harvard. My daddy was an ambassador. My uncle was an ambassador. And I'm going to Saudi Arabia to give them strategic intelligence so they can keep slaughtering more Yemenis. Oh, you don't know about that. That only happened a couple of years ago. So this is serious. They're tired of getting slaughtered. Again, wait till you see some of your top trends of 2024 because it relates to this. More than 100,000 workers at U.S.-based tech companies have been laid off in mass job cuts this year. No shit. In your Trends Journal, this is our 65th week of listing job cuts. This is serious, and it's going to get a lot worse in the new year. Look what Drudge puts up. Prague gunman kills 14 in student terror at UNI. Murdered his own dad. Rampage rocks Europe. Not one article in the Drudge Report about the Israel war and the slaughter of over 20,000 Palestinians. Oh, this guy killed 14 people and his dad. Oh, in all of Europe. Oh my God. That's the shit they shovel down your throat. How about the 70% of those dead over there being women and children? Now, who cares? They're only Palestinians. Oh, but in Prague, that's big fucking news. This is the shit they're shoveling down your throat. They're shit dealers. You go to the Cartoon News Network, CNN, the big story. This victim on the Green River killer now has a name. Authorities, a bunch of fucking shit. I'm an authority. You're just a piece of crap. I'm an authority. Authorities say they identified remains belonging to a teenager who ran away from a family's home in 1992. What the fuck do I care? Not a word, not one word on the whole front page of the Cartoon News Network about the slaughter, the genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinians. So I encourage you to visit trendsjournal.com because we're giving you what nobody else is. So support us. We're supporting you. And don't forget, Celente the Judge, a great interview I did with Judge Napolitano yesterday.
From Cam C. Will corrupt politicians and officials ever be held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity they are guilty of committing? Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you and yours. God bless. Merry Christmas to you as well, Cam C. I don't think so. I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu will be held accountable for the war crimes he's committing, and he's committing thousands of them. If you watched Professor Mearsheimer on this program yesterday, and if you watch Max Blumenthal at 5:15 this afternoon here, you will see that the numbers of murdered innocents are staggering. 20,000 Palestinians murdered, about 16,000 of them women and children. 14,000 women and children. The remaining 6,000, about 2/3 innocent males, and maybe the remaining 2,000 Hamas fighters. So the death and destruction, the torment, the denial of food, shelter, clothing, heat, medical supplies is catastrophic and overwhelming. And so there's no dispute but that this is a war crime. The question is, will Netanyahu be prosecuted? Will Joe Biden be prosecuted for facilitating this? Will Tony Blinken be prosecuted? Lloyd Austin be prosecuted? No, and no. Because the American government controls here we go again, levers of power at the courts that do these prosecutions. It's usually only low-level people that you never heard of who are prosecuted for some sort of a war crime, and sometimes they're convicted and sometimes they're acquitted. Very sad. Question, Judge, I believe NATO is an outdated and unnecessary entity which should have been dismantled when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1791. Who or what decides the existence of NATO? Let me say first, I agree with you. Donald Trump said he agreed with you, but he didn't follow through on withdrawing us. There are two ways that we can withdraw from a treaty. One is for the president just to say, I'm not going to honor it again. And that's wrong, and it's unconstitutional, but presidents have gotten away with it. George W. Bush did that to the ABM treaty. The ABM treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was a great treaty. It stopped the Russians, and it stopped the Americans from the arms race. Once Bush decided he didn't want to follow it, the arms race heated up again. The other way is for a formal rescission of the treaty, and that would require a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Presidents don't do that. because they don't want to take the time and the effort and the political effort to persuade 2/3 of the Senate. Remember how a treaty comes about. President proposes, 2/3 of the Senate ratifies. It doesn't go to the House. It is a rare thing in American law that is only passed by one House. And where does it rank in American law? Equal to the Constitution. Also, Grassy Knoll, Judge, in your opinion, when was the last time we had a government that upheld the Constitution? Probably Thomas Jefferson. Although I'm not so sure that the Louisiana Purchase was consistent with the Constitution, which tripled the size of the United States when Jefferson sent 15 million in cash to Napoleon, who desperately needed it to continue fighting the Napoleonic Wars. And as a result, he got everything from Ohio to Minnesota and all the way down to Louisiana. The last president that I know of who vetoed legislation because it was unconstitutional and stated so was Calvin Coolidge, a president who actually hated the presidency and hated being in the White House. But if you heard the conversation I just had with Gary Barnett, you've heard me say this, and I'll repeat it. You may have heard me say it before. Formally, we still have a constitution. Basically, we still have a president, we still have a federal judiciary, we still have a Congress, we still have two houses in the Congress. The House of Representatives sits for 2 years, the Senate sits for 6 years. But functionally, we don't have a constitution anymore at all, because the purpose of the Constitution was twofold: to constitute, to establish the federal government, and to restrain the federal government. So as an instrument of restraint, the Constitution has failed miserably. The federal government's powers are radically out of proportion to what's written down in the Constitution. So the federal government bribes the states with cash, the rich with bailouts, the middle class with tax cuts, the poor with wealth distribution. And as long as it keeps engaging in that bribery, it will stay in power. But one day, enough people will say, enough is enough. We're not listening. We're not paying attention. We're leaving the government. I hope I'm around when that happens. Vlad Freeman, question: how does a state succeed? By bribery. By bribery is how the states succeed. What is the state? Lowercase s. It is that which has a monopoly of force in a given geographic area. Try and hire your own police department. Forget about it. You and they will all be arrested. You will obey the government that has the monopoly on force in your area. That is, of course, the attitude of the state. Government is force. The state is force. It is not logic. It is not reason. It is not morality. It is force. Until we recognize that, and until we starve it to death so it can't pay for the force that keeps it in power, it'll keep its thumb on us. I think we'll do one more, and then I'll rest my voice. Mark Brown. Hi, Judge. How does the U.S. administration sleep at night after it vetoes the ending of an ongoing genocide? They are cold, calculating killers who perpetuate genocide and who refuse to stop it, and they don't have consciences, and that's how they sleep at night.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
I consider Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson both to be great men. I have enormous respect for both of them. I think their work is nothing short of heroic. They are two of the loudest and most intelligent anti-war voices in the country. They're great on so many things. Libertarian economics is not one of them. So let's play the clip, and we will respond.
I think a lot of people have awakened to the now demonstrable fact that libertarian economics was a scam perpetrated by the beneficiaries of the economic system that they were defending. So they created this whole intellectual framework to justify the private equity culture that's hollowed out the country. That's my personal view, and I've seen it up close my whole life. So I think it's a fair assessment.
All right, so let's pause it there. The whole deal here is that the federal government of the United States of America is the biggest institution in the history of the world. And they suck out $6 trillion every year from the economy and pass it out to the politically connected. And the Federal Reserve at the same time is totally debasing the currency. And then for years, it's had these insane artificially low interest rates. Even today, the interest rates are crazy artificially low, even though after these raises. And this allows for what? An economy based around speculation. And none of this is true laissez-faire capitalism or anything even remotely close. We don't live under anything remotely close to libertarian economics. And so to take this current, it's this thing that libertarians always have to deal with, right? Like, we are simultaneously criticized for being like, oh, you guys are these ideologues who can't convince the rest of Americans that, your ideas are worth getting on board on. And that's why you have no real political power. I mean, what real political power do libertarians have? We got Rand Paul and Thomas Massey. And on a good day, Mike Lee. Who else do we got? Maybe you can put together like 5 other, decent people in the House of Representatives. You can't really find me another senator. But that's it. So it's like, oh, look, you guys have no real political power. And also, you're responsible for every failure of the system. Even though you have no political power and we won't try any of your policies out, you're also responsible for what's going on now. It's kind of unfair that someone who is a banker, they get to claim, oh, they don't have income, but because they make all of their income from investments. And so they're paying like a 15% tax rate, while somebody who just works might be paying double that, maybe more. And you're like, okay, that's true. Right? That's true. There's an unfairness to that. But this is where being precise really matters, because you see immediately, right? There's kind of two options of how you could fix that problem, right? Like if you're saying it's unfair that investment banker pays 15% and electrician pays 35%. Okay, that's unfair. So how do we fix that? Well, there's one of two ways. Okay? You either raise investment bankers' taxes or you lower electricians' taxes. Some combination of both, I guess, but those are basically your options. But so now think this through for a little bit. Let's say we raise the investment bankers' taxes to 35%. Okay, we make capital gains 35%. Well, now we don't have the problem of the unfairness anymore, right? They're both paying 35% for the sake of argument. Okay, now was that electrician helped at all? Okay, here's what you get. There's going to be a little bit more revenue going to Joe Biden's federal government. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to take in that revenue. Actually, the extra money that is coming in has already been spent, and 1,000 times over, right? We're already spending way more money than we bring in through taxes, and we do it by borrowing or just printing the money. We also got tens of trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities for entitlement programs. So, this money just basically evaporates into the swamp of DC. So, like, do you really think that this guy's life would be better off if the swamp had a little bit more money, if they brought a little bit more revenue? And let's assume, by the way, that they actually get more revenue, because as you know, raising rates doesn't always equate to more revenue coming in, but whatever. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, the DC swamp gets a little bit more money. Is that going to help this guy's life? I mean, if money going to the federal government were helping people's lives, this guy would be fine already, right? Because there's already $6 trillion being spent in Washington, D.C. every year. So as Tucker said, let's look at our current economic system, whatever you want to call it. Let's judge it by how it works for people. All right, fair game. Let's do that. How is that helping this guy at all? Now, let's look at the other option. We could lower this guy's taxes from 35% to 15%. Has that helped him? It's life-changing. His life is already so much tangibly better because we did that, right? That guy is now, just anybody out there who's working full-time, who's paying, let's say, 30-something% in tax. If your taxes got lowered this year to 15%, you would be so excited at the prospect of that, because it would make your life so much materially better immediately. So see, that's why being precise matters, because you're going to get to one of two solutions here, one of which will do nothing to improve anybody's life, and one of which will actually help the people who you're claiming to want to help so much.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
The problem is, it looks like Republicans, like the Republican base, doesn't really seem to have much interest in issues like this. They say they do, but I don't think they do. The general public, I don't think they do. For example, the Tea Party was a brief flash in the pan, but even were they willing to make the kinds of cuts that would be necessary? I highly doubt it. So unfortunately, you're making your stand on maybe the most unpopular thing of all. I mean, it's easy to go after, woke leftists or Antifa criminals or whatever, because everybody understands how crazy that is. But people like getting checks in the mail with their names on them. And that is a very, very hard addiction to break.
I agree with you. And the worst episode of that was, with the so-called stimmies in response to the lockdown, in which everyone got a check, except maybe the top 10% of the households. If you were a family of 4 with 2 wage earners who got laid off, you got all the stimmy checks, the child care credits. You were also eligible for the unemployment topper on top of, which was $1,000 a week, on top of the state benefits. It could add up to 30, 40, even 50,000 a year of handouts from the government. That happened on Trump's watch. He signed it. It was, the worst excess of that thing that we've encountered yet. And it's another reason why I think he's already proved he's not even remotely the right person for the job. This is important because his term began in 2017 after we were well into the business cycle recovery after the Great Recession. And, even, sort of conservative / Keynesian Friedmanites that had dominated the Republican Party always believed that when you got into the middle and back end of the business cycle, it was time to sober up. You needed to get back to, market rates of interest. You needed to get the budget balanced or even in surplus. Trump went the other way when they tried, as you remember, belatedly to begin raising interest rates, and then they went into QT in 2018 and 2019. Trump was all over the case of the Fed and blaming them for even, trying to get interest rates within the range of something that was meaningful in real terms after inflation. So that's why I think, the indictment is so strong. It came at the wrong time, and it was really the wrong message, utterly wrong. As I say in the book, I think that he was more, irresponsible, reckless on monetary policy than, William Jennings Bryan or Wright Patman or any other monetary quacks who've made their way across the scene in American economic history recently. So again, we can't have someone back in the Oval Office who's going to be on the Fed's case, to ease money, to lower interest rates, to buy in the federal debt, which is exactly what I think predictably he would do if he gets a second term.
I think the thing that bothers me the most is you have a passage in the book quoting Trump on his opinions on monetary policy. Now, there are some things I am later on, David, so mentally prepare yourself. I am later on going to ask you to name me a couple of good things about Trump, okay? So get those wheels turning, okay?
Yeah.
But on things like this, any sensible person at all just has to shake his head, because he would say things like he speaks as if there is no downside to lowering interest rates. Of course, we all like low interest rates, and so the only obstacle is a lack of political will or dummies on the Federal Reserve Board or whatever. Like, there are no economic consequences. There's no meaning to interest rates. They can just be arbitrarily set wherever we like. There's you wouldn't even pause to wonder. It seems like there is absolutely no reason not to do this, but there must be some. I wonder what it is.
Well, it's obvious that market-set interest rates are what allocates capital, what allocates economic activity. If we've known for decades and decades and decades, the price system is fundamental to capitalist prosperity. And if you don't have, at least reasonably honest quasi-market prices in the financial system, we're going to end up with the mess we have today, huge financial bubbles. We're going to be sending the wrong message to Capitol Hill. In other words, the federal debt doesn't matter because the carry cost actually of the debt, when the Fed finally had the interest rates down to rock bottom, averaged 1.6%. Well, the politicians aren't going to worry about the cost of financing the debt and the carry cost of the debt if you drive the weighted average cost of the 34 trillion federal debt to almost a rounding error. So that's the problem is, if you want to turn Wall Street into a speculative casino, and if you want to turn Washington into a runaway spending machine, then artificially depress interest rates to non-economic levels.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Remember when they were talking about, hey, we got to go blow up that hospital because that hospital is the main artery. It's the main base. There was a lot of conversation about how important of a strategic asset the hospital was. And then Dave pointed out on the Part of the Problem podcast that the tunnel that they knew existed there was apparently because Israel had built that tunnel. And then I was like, yeah, and they also just found like a couple guns. Like, I'm not saying Hamas wasn't there, but was that a main place for Hamas? Was that actually the main artery, the main command center? Definitely made you think, like when you saw those movies and the Terminators have taken over the entire world and you got the one underground base left that they're making all the decisions from. They really made it seem like it was that, which it's appeared to not have been. And then afterwards, they're pointing at random shreds of evidence, like when you were a dumb second grader and you're walking around picking up trash can and saying, hey, this is a clue for what mystery? I don't know. You and your other kid have an imagination. You're being a bunch of idiots. And that's basically the strategy that they took of just picking up random, oh, look, there's a curtain here, clearly, and then look, a single gun, and look at this. So that was the way I looked at it. I was like, man, Israel really walked back that story of being the absolute main, the main thing. And so here you go. This is from, this was actually from the Week magazine summarizing the Washington Post report. Scant evidence of Hamas presence at a hospital. A Washington Post analysis published Thursday concluded the evidence provided by the Israeli government falls short of proving that Hamas was running a command and control center at Gaza City Al-Shifa Hospital. Before and after Israeli forces stormed the complex on November 15th, Israeli Defense Forces officials said they had concrete evidence that Hamas was operating in tunnels and bunkers under the medical complex, the Palestinians' enclave's largest. Terrorists came here to command their operations, Israel Defense spokesperson Daniel Hagari said on November 22nd, but the Post reported that the rooms connected to a tunnel the IDF found showed no sign of military activity, and none of the 5 hospital buildings Hagari pointed to had access to tunnels. So, at least thus far, that absolutely need to go into that hospital because it was a main base, at least thus far, appears to be disproven. Now, this was an even more damning article from the New York Times. And now, once again, every other topic, I see things from the New York Times, and I can usually tell you exactly whether they're lying to you. On this one, I'm just telling you I'm telling you what's being reported. This was a Times investigation tracked Israel's use of its most destructive bombs in South Gaza. And this is above the picture. Visual evidence shows Israel dropped 2,000-pound bombs where it ordered Gaza's civilians to move for safety. So they told people to go to specific areas, and then they were dropping 2,000-pound bombs on those areas. During the first 6 weeks of the war in Gaza, Israel routinely used one of its biggest and most restrictive bombs in areas it designated safe for civilians. And so Israel, in response to this, in response to questions about the bomb use in South Gaza, an Israeli military spokesperson said in a statement to the Times that Israel's priority was destroying Hamas, and questions of this kind will be looked into at a later stage. So what does that mean? It's I mean, if you guys are dropping bombs on civilians in the areas that you're telling them that you have to go to, you're telling me that doesn't sound like enough that you should probably act on it now? Yeah, we're going to deal with this stuff later. We've got more important things to do, like bombing more civilians. And then he said, the spokesperson also said that the IDF takes feasible precautions to mitigate civilian harm. Safe and effective. Will I write to you? Yeah, okay. That sounds like you guys have actual... It sounds like you caught us red-handed, but, we're doing everything we can, and, we're going to continue what we're doing, and we'll answer these questions later. The reason I guess I point out these articles is that, to me, you can be pro-Israel, and, I'm not, I like the country. I visited the country. I'd like to go back to the country. I think at this point, they got to contend with the fact that it doesn't matter what happened in the past. People are both there. They're going to have to figure out how to live with each other. You can be pro the state of Israel, and you can think that the state of Israel has a right to exist, and you can think that they even have a right to defend themselves. But I think you can also, any reasonable person can read shit like this and just go, what they're doing is unacceptable. And I think anyone who's not willing to do that is actually at this point not contending with reality. This is from the Associate Press. The White House criticized the flight and accused Abbott of using migrants for politics. Yet again, Governor Abbott is showing how little regard or respect he has for human beings. White House spokesperson Angelo Fernandez, that's really the guy's name, said in a statement, this latest political stunt just adds to the tally of extreme policies which seek to demonize and dehumanize people. And what is your border policy? What does that do for people? It's like, yeah, when you compare fantasy to reality, fantasy looks a lot better. If you want to pretend that we have unlimited resources and that anyone can come into the country and we've got a warm bed for them, fresh soup, a job, and that they're not going to be taking anything from anybody else, well then if that actually is an achievable goal, why not just let everyone into the country? Why aren't you out there going to the deepest corners and the most third world backwards places and letting people know you don't have to be sitting in this trash pit? Take my hand. I can bring you to this place called America that has unlimited resources and can provide for anybody. It's very easy if you're comparing reality to fantasy to go, hey, how dare you expose reality? Reality's grim. Reality, there's going to be people who die alone. There's going to be people who have cancer. Yes, there are grim aspects to reality. And guess what? If you're going to shame people for actually letting people know what reality is, living in the fantasy does not help. It's like when it's a delusional person who doesn't realize that their addiction's a problem, and at some point they have to actually contend with reality. And if you're the enabler stepping in and going, hey, don't let that person know that he's an addict. Don't let him know that he ruined the whole family, that he spent all of his money, and that he's going to be dead in 2 years. And, the people that relied upon him are going to always don't tell him that this is dehumanizing. You're dehumanizing this individual by pointing out what reality actually is.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
But what we talked a lot about was the color revolutions and how the State Department, through the National Endowment for Democracy and all these other, NGO organizations, have been responsible for promoting and ultimately directing, to a certain extent, revolutions throughout the rest of the world. And I genuinely believe, and I can only say this because I'm suspended on YouTube for a couple more days, and as soon as I'm back over there, I'll stop saying it. But I genuinely believe that we are living through a color revolution. That the CIA, in tandem, potentially, with the CCP, are working feverishly to get you and I at the throats of our neighbors so that they can implement whatever totalitarian plans they have. Central bank digital currency, full surveillance, full biometric data hacking, all this shit, right? I really think that's the play. That's the play. And to a certain extent, I think that Donald Trump is just a tool being used in that process. He is almost certainly an unwitting participant. But that's my honest opinion as to what we're up against. And it's going to get wild. I am almost always kind to Tucker Carlson. This is a rare moment where I'm going to be very, very critical.
He was on with Glenn Greenwald over the past week, and they were talking economics. And I was none too pleased with his assessment. Now, I'm not a hater. As you know, I praise Tucker constantly. Big fan of his, actually. But when it comes to economics, the man does not know what he's talking about.
I think a smarter way to assess an economic system is by its results. So you can assign whatever name you want to the economic system of the United States. You could call it market capitalism. You could call it, you could call it a whole host of different things. But I don't think any of that's useful. Those are boring conversations. I think you need to ask, does this economic system produce a lot of dollar stores? And if it does, it's not a system that you want because it degrades people and it makes their lives worse and it increases exponentially the amount of ugliness in your society. And anything that increases ugliness is evil.
That you're having an increase in these very cheap retail stores is not so much that we have a libertarian economic order, but rather because we have a centrally planned economy, which is creating inflation through the Federal Reserve and through the Treasury, but also just kind of broadly diminishing our existence, our income levels, our standard of living. These are a product of a crony capitalist fascistic model that also has a central bank, which is rapidly deteriorating the purchasing power of the dollar. And I think anybody that has any grasp of economics can make that argument very succinctly. And I don't understand why Tucker, being a guy who I find to be quite intelligent, would be this off base. But
there. So if it's such a good system, why do we have all these dollar stores? Dollar store is the clear, I mean, it's not the only ugly thing being created in the United States, but it's one of the most common, and it's certainly the most obvious. So if you
let me answer that. The reason that we have more and more dollar stores is because more and more people are barely hanging on, largely because of Donald Trump, who permitted for the economy to be destroyed in the last year of his presidency, but also obviously the central bankers, Congress, who passed these multi-trillion-dollar bills, things that we never would have imagined possible in all of American history, and they happened repeatedly over the past 4 years. So this is the reason that people are they're struggling. They're suffering. The reason that they're suffering, though, is not because of a libertarian economic order, but rather because of a centrally planned economy with a central bank that also is diminishing the purchasing power of the dollar.
You have a dollar store, you're degraded. And any town that has a dollar store does not get better, it gets worse. And the people who live there lead lives that are worse. So, and the counter argument to the extent there is one, they buy cheaper stuff. Great. But they become more unhappy. And the dollar store itself is a sort of symbol. What's a physical thing. It's a real thing. It's not just a metaphor, but it's also a metaphor for your total lack of control over where you live and over the imposition of aggressively in-your-face ugly structures that send one message to you, which is you mean nothing. You are a consumer, not a human being or a citizen. And so, again, I don't know what we call our current system, but its effects are grotesque. They're grotesque. It's wrecked. I've been here 54 years and I watch carefully. That's my only gift is I watch.
See, this is the issue, is that he then says he doesn't know what you call it. Well, then don't call it a libertarian economic order, because it's not one. It's not even close to one. It's almost 180 degrees away from what a libertarian would prescribe to remedy some of these very legitimate issues that you're pointing out. But the problem is that he called the 99-cent stores or the dollar stores a symbol. What they are is a symptom. He's very close, but he gave it the wrong label. It is a symptom of the disease. The disease is inflation. The disease is fascism. It is cronyism. It is inflation. It is central banking. These are the dollar stores and Walmart's success and all of these other companies that have blossomed during this period, including Amazon, are a product, or rather a symptom of the disease. The disease is not libertarian capitalism. The disease is actually moving away from capitalism into a more totalitarian economic framework.
You know, the Fed manipulates and pretend they know how to manage monetary policy, and it's exactly opposite of what sound money would be like, because the market dictates what the interest rates would be, the saving rates, and all these things. But when you manage the whole economy, and they are the central economic planners, the Federal Reserve, and they want to say they're independent, and that's why they don't want anybody to have an audit of it. They want to be independent because they have to take care of the welfare state, because if they're spending money, the Fed has to accommodate. And also for the same reason they have to accommodate those in the military-industrial complex. Oh, that's for national security, which is a bunch of baloney, because it doesn't help it. It undermines our national security when we get ourselves involved in wars around the world and have troops in 150 countries and all this. So that's a fallacy. But the main daily tool that they use, and what just happened recently on this announcement that the Fed is pivoting, which means is they're going to keep interest rates low and get them lower. And that's why everybody's euphoric, and therefore interest rates being down, the people who are in the daily trading said, oh, well, if interest rates are going down, I'm going to get out of saving the money. And for this day, at least, it looks like they decided to buy the gold. But if it's a day where they recognize maybe in a month or so interest rates are really going up, they'll be back. And the gold prices are inevitably going to keep going up because of the function of our government, which is to spend, borrow, and there's not enough people who want to loan the money, so the Fed has to print the money, and that's where the problem is. But the Fed is obsessed with their expertise in managing the economy, and the magic number for the Fed now for many years, at least a decade, they've emphasized it, is if we if we could just get it where we destroy the value of the dollar at 2% a year, boy, that would be wonderful. That means they're going to steal 2%. What if we put your money in the bank and say, okay, yeah, you can use my money, but the bank tells you, yes, but it's going to be worth the last 2% if you keep it in the bank. Well, they did this and thinking 2% was a wonderful solution. So one time, not too long ago, the market was dictating and what the Fed was doing. They took it because the Fed was hysterical. They took interest rates down below zero, which was crazy and historic. So they worked hard. We got to calm the markets down because they think things are being distorted with negative interest rates. So they kept pestering. We got to get this inflation up to 2%. And my prediction then was it'll get to 2%, then it's going to get a lot higher. and that's exactly what happened. The distortions of this interest rate thing will continue, and it's going to get worse. But for right now, today, the targets is approaching, and it's just about ready to make the final announcement. We have conquered inflation. As you would guess, Chris, I don't believe that.
No way. And you're right, and the government has proven that they are full throttle until they destroy everything. And but if that's the way it's going to be, then so be it. Then what has to happen is when that happens, there has to be enough people that want to do the right thing once they destroy the currency, whenever that happens to be. And it doesn't have to be a majority of people, not even close. Most people follow. So you don't need the majority. You just need enough people that understand, and if the more influential they are, the better. To understand sound money and have influential people say this is the way we have to go now. They destroyed everything, now we have to go this way. And sound money means what we have in the Constitution. What we have today is unconstitutional. They don't have the right to counterfeit, but they just ignore the Constitution and do it. So that's what we need, is money that cannot be counterfeited. And that's why we talk about gold on the show, because it cannot be counterfeited. That's why governments for hundreds of years tried to eliminate gold out of the consciousness of people, because they can't counterfeit it. And let's say you have that sound money again. The biggest plus that it would do is with war, because war is what is bringing our country down. It has totally bled us dry. Our military-industrial complex empire, they take money so easily, just say the words national security and that's it. And that would change because the politicians would have to ask us for money to fight wars. They would have to say, we want to fight this war, and we would have to agree to it. Today, they don't care what we think. They tell us the next war that they're going to fight. So, and they wouldn't be able to promise all this free stuff because they can't counterfeit the money. And we would only go to war when we actually feel like we have to defend ourselves, which is probably so rare that we wouldn't have to worry about war in a sense that we do today, where it's just bleeding us dry. And none of this would create a paradise here because, there would still be theft, there would still be crimes, there would still be sin. There's no system that we can make. The only thing we can do is better or worse. Sound money is much, much better than this disaster that we're living through now, that we're waiting, to finally get rid of it. So that's the way we want to go. How things play out is still a mystery.
In spite of it all, I think the Merry Christmas that I have it's not that difficult to understand. It's not that difficult. Most people know. Think of it in terms of the individual. The individual knows they can't borrow $1 million every month and live beyond their means. Eventually, the banker calls it debt due. That's what happens in a nation. The debt is called in, and it's done by the money losing value, and that's what's going to happen. So I think that knowing that and knowing what to do, if we did it, that would be a Merry Christmas. And we feel very often during the year that we do reach some people, and that's why we're so delighted to present our case to our viewers and our supporters, because that is what it counts, and spreading the message is very key. So I hope everybody has a Merry Christmas and spread the message of liberty. Thank you for tuning in today, and please return soon.
In Aristotle's view that man is born tabula rasa and then develops concepts from percepts, would he include introspective knowledge as well as extrospective in this scheme? Yes. You're not born with knowledge of your mental states any more than of knowledge of physical facts. You have to first look in and grasp the data. And the faculty which does that, he thought, was called the common sense. That was his name for it. The faculty which is self-conscious, able to introspect and grasp the nature of the mental activities we were engaging in. And so you need data from the common sense, what we would call today introspection, which you then proceed to conceptualize in the normal fashion. You say that Aristotle was the first influential empiricist in the Western world. Does this mean that there was one before him? Yes. In a way, the sophists are empiricists. They don't believe in innate ideas. They believe that everything begins with experience. They happen, however, to believe that everything ends with experience also, and that experience gives you no knowledge. So they are skeptical empiricists, and that's just what David Hume later made all empiricists into, and that's what they all are today, with rare exceptions. Did Aristotle originate the concept of abstraction from particulars to grasp universals? Well, of course, there were leads in Plato, insofar as Plato said you had to have the stimuli of the senses in order to rise to abstraction. But so far as I know, as a formal theory of abstraction, as against simply recollective stimuli, yes, he did originate that. What, if any, is the difference between induction and abstraction? As they're used today, it varies from writer to writer. Sometimes abstraction is said to be the process operating to form concepts from percepts, whereas induction is the process of forming general principles from individual facts. But that usage is by no means standard. Abstraction is sometimes used for any mental process which consists of selective focusing, in which you ignore one part of the data and focus on the rest. And in that respect, induction would involve abstraction as well as concept formation involving abstraction. So that the only thing that is for sure is that induction is commonly used to apply only to propositional truths, to arrive at full-fledged laws, all men are mortal, etc. Whereas abstraction is used either for concept formation or for the overall mental process common to concept formation and generalization. According to Aristotle, are the primary premises of a given science arrived at by intuition? In other words, the first principles that you reach at the end. Yes, he says yes. Now here's another case where obviously objectivism would disagree with Aristotle. You see, he patterned all sciences on mathematics, which was partly the Pythagorean Platonist influence, but partly the fact that that was the one developed science where they had reached first principles. And so he just assumed that the same thing will be true in physics, in biology, etc. And that therefore there would be a counterpart to it. A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points in physics. And in fact, he thought he had found such primary principles of physics, which when you grasp are simply self-evident, in the same way that the mathematical axioms are, only it takes a lot of knowledge to get to them. Now, he had no idea of the incredible complexity of science, and it's been said by a number of people that it's a good thing he didn't. Because if the Greeks knew how fantastically complicated it would be to unearth all the laws of the physical world, well, some people hypothesize they would never have started. They would simply have given up. Maybe not, but in any event, it would be, in effect, like asking a child who's beginning to read read the 13 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary overnight. It would be too much, and so you can't ask that. Now, if you ask me a different question, well, how would science come to an end? If it's not by intuitive, self-evident principles that you reach, how? I would say that answer would be dictated by your answer to the question of induction. Because as part of a full theory of induction, you will have to go into a theory of theory formation. There are, after all, other ways of arriving at general principles than simple inductive generalization. The atomic theory, for instance, you do not arrive at by inductive generalization. So Aristotle is deficient in not fully recognizing in his epistemology the crucial importance of theory formation. You do not arrive, for instance, at the atomic theory by saying, I observe that this is made of atoms, and this is, and this is, and therefore everything is. You arrive at the atomic theory in quite a different way by saying, now I observe many individual facts, what would explain it? And then you hypothesize something that is not directly observable in the normal case. Now the rules, or what kind of scientific hypotheses are valid or not, is part of the issue of induction and has to be treated along with the topic of inductive generalization. And when you have the answers there, and that will be given you ultimately by your theory of concept formation. So it's simply a matter of drawing the corollaries from the theory of concept formation. When you have those answers, you'll know what would end a science. When you commented that the laws of induction had not been written out, did you mean to imply someone had discovered them but hadn't yet written them out? I mean, to be very precise, that objectivism in my judgment, that is to say, Ayn Rand's epistemology, has formulated the principles of the answer to the problem of induction. But those principles have not been written out as applied specifically to induction. And I trust one day, within all of our lifetimes, they will be. Could you give us an indication of what a valid defense of the principle of induction would be? Does it involve the law of causality? Well, if you mean a justification of the general procedure of induction, Aristotle himself gives you the material for that. You are justified in generalizing because, in fact, cause and effect is a law of reality. And therefore, the instances that we observe are not chance coincidences, and therefore we can justifiably generalize in general. But if you ask me, but how do you know in a particular case that the sample you have observed is really representative of a law and not simply a coincidence, or something that depends on a necessary condition that you haven't identified? Then you are asking me for the detailed theory of the actual practice of induction, and that is what I suggest you read in the book, which I mentioned in the previous question, which has not yet been written. What is the objectivist view of Aristotle's distinction between essences and properties, leaving aside the fact that Aristotle considered essences to be intrinsic rather than objective? Well, if you leave that and everything it implies aside, then objectivism subscribes to it. We do distinguish between the essence and the consequences of the essence. When, for instance, Miss Rand says that it is wrong to define capitalism as the system that leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number, even though in fact it does, that is based on the Aristotelian idea that the essence is the fundamental and the properties are its consequences, and that it's a catastrophe epistemologically to confuse the two. In that sense, objectivism subscribes to it. But of course, the issue of essences being intrinsic, tied in as it is with his idea that universals are formal structures inherent in things, is the heart of the metaphysical aspect of that doctrine, and with that, as I indicated, objectivism disagrees. After forming a definition, can one arbitrarily form a word for that concept, or is the word chosen based on the units of the concept? Well, first of all, I don't know, are you asking me qua objectivist or expositor of Aristotle? But if I understand you, it doesn't make any difference anyway. If you distinguish the word from the concept, then you must mean by the word the particular sound or shape used, because the word qua standing for those particular units that it integrates is, of course, the concept. Now, obviously, you're free to choose any noise you want. If you get a certain group and abstract and form the class that we now call man, there's nothing metaphysically or epistemologically sacrosanct about the sound man, as against the sound mensch, or lom, or homo, or anthropos, or whatever it happens to be. And therefore, the sound is absolutely free. You can make it whatever you want, so long as you are consistent. But if you step into a developed language and propose to speak to other speakers in that language, and say, however, I intend to use words in my own special way, and hereafter I'm going to mean by man, banana. Now, I want everybody in this room to volunteer for a cake. If you talk that way, that is out. Why would a definition of man as a rational mammal or rational living thing be wrong? Let me try to put it to you this way. It would not be wrong according to the objectivist view of definition, which differs from the Aristotelian view of definition. Aristotle believes that essences are intrinsic. That is to say, he believes that the characteristics which make up the essence of an entity, or of a class of entities, are carved out by nature entirely independently of man's state of knowledge. And therefore, whether we do or don't know whatever facts, the essence is fixed to once and for all by reality. It is a fact inhering in the entity the same way the length, the size, and the shape are. Now, objectivism does not take this view. Objectivism holds that essences are objective, neither subjective nor intrinsic, that they represent facts of reality, therefore are not subjective, but facts as categorized by human beings in accordance with their process of acquiring knowledge. And therefore, for objectivism, you have to always ask in connection with definitions and essences, what is the purpose, cognitively? The purpose is to enable us to distinguish our concepts, to differentiate one concept from another. The characteristics which will do this at one frame of knowledge are quite different from those which will do it in another. And thus, for instance, if you are at a very primitive stage and all you know is thing, and you can tell that man is a rational thing and other things are not, thing is a perfectly reputable genus. Now, as your knowledge expands and you begin to want to make more important distinctions than simply thing versus non-thing, and you begin to tell living thing versus non-living and animal versus plant, your genus begins to narrow to the point where it is specific enough to capture the kind of knowledge of man that is required at your present knowledge and to differentiate man from all the other things. Now, how specific do you get? As specific as is necessary to integrate your knowledge. If you are a physicist, a biologist, and you will work constantly with subdivisions of animal, it's perfectly justified to say man is the rational mammal as distinct from other types in that context. But within the framework of generalized human knowledge, that is not specialized, animal is the genus which defines man specifically enough without becoming too specialized. And therefore, objectivism would say that within the framework of present knowledge, it is the best general genus for man. Now, of course, Aristotle, following the Platonic influence, says that The essence is carved out by nature, and therefore there can be no such thing as contextual essences or contextual definitions. That is one central point at which objectivism disagrees with Aristotle. Although he has many valuable rules of definition, both he and Plato ultimately say the definition has to come down to an act of nous, that is, of that intuitive grasp. And there, unfortunately, intuition is used in a less rational sense, as a direct insight. And of course, that makes the whole theory vulnerable to the charge of being implicitly mystical, which is not Aristotle's intention, but is the actual net effect. Now, obviously, I couldn't hope to make the whole objectivist view clear. I wouldn't attempt to. In an answer to a question on Aristotle, I simply refer you to Miss Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, where this is discussed at length. Would you contrast Aristotle's concept of explanation with the positivist notion that explanation is merely description? Yes, certainly. The positivists, the followers of Auguste Comte, and a whole string of them, who added in a corruption of logic in addition and called themselves logical positivists in the 20th century, declare in essence that there is no such thing as explanation. All you can do is describe brute, inexplicable facts. You can, in effect, give a summary of the sense data that trot by your eyes, and perhaps, if they are not too pessimistic, you can generalize and form some general rules that for some inexplicable reason this particular sense datum is followed by this one as a normal rule. Of course, you can never be certain according to them. That's why the school is called positivism. Now, Aristotle, of course, fundamentally repudiates that entire view. Explanation is different from description if description means simply a recitation and summary of the sense data going by you. Explanation is a conceptual identification of the causes in terms of general principles and by reference to the nature of the acting entities. It is therefore not something accessible to a simple perceptual level mentality, and it's something real and crucial in human knowledge. It's that which enables us to rise above the animal level. Now, of course, in a broader sense, you can say explanations are descriptions. The atomic theory is an explanation of many facts, but the atomic theory is a description of a fact of reality. So in that sense, everything, of course, is a description. But then there's a big difference between description, which is just a concrete bound description of sense data, and a description which is a much more fundamental account of the causes of what you observe. It's the latter sense which is Aristotle's.